How can the wind kill a climber who has already stood on 5 8,000ers? On Dhaulagiri, it can. In the spring of 2018, the Italian Simone La Terra pitches his tent on a ridge at an altitude of around 6,900 meters. During the night, a single gust snatches it up, with the man still inside. His body will be found 800 meters lower. And here's the strangest part. 5 years earlier, this very mountain had already turned him back with its wind, and that time, it let him go alive. What made him return to a summit that had once said no? And why was this mountain, all but forgotten today, once believed to be the highest on Earth? There are mountains whose names everyone knows: Everest, K2, Annapurna. And then there's this one, which once stood taller than all of them in the human imagination, yet today lives somewhere on the edge of our attention. Dhaulagiri, the seventh highest peak in the world, 8,167 meters of rock and ice in the very heart of Nepal, in a range that bears its own name, the Dhaulagiri Himal. The name comes from Sanskrit, and translated it sounds almost like an incantation. The dazzling white mountain. That's no poetic exaggeration. Its snowy walls reflect the light so fiercely that on a clear day it actually hurts to look at it. In the early 19th century, for roughly 3 decades straight, Dhaulagiri was officially considered the tallest mountain on the planet. The map makers of the time were certain there was nothing higher. Then the world recalculated Kangchenjunga, and later they measured Everest, and Dhaulagiri quietly slipped into the shadows. The former record holder turned into a mountain that people walk past on their way to louder names. The first people reached its summit only in 1960, a Swiss-Austrian team. Since then, the mountain has been building up its grim statistics. About 87 people have stayed on it forever. The death rate hovers around 16%. Roughly speaking, that's 1 life for every 6 or 7 who reach the top. In terms of fatalities, Dhaulagiri ranks 4th among all the 8,000ers, behind only Annapurna, K2, and Nanga Parbat. Why does it kill so often? There are several reasons. The approach to it is long, 7, sometimes 10 days, up the narrow Mayagdi Kola Valley. That means any rescue moves slowly. It also has a nickname, the Mountain of Storms. The weather here changes within a few hours, and the wind on the ridges reaches hurricane force. Add to that the avalanche-prone slopes on the standard route, the west face that rises around 4,000 meters, and the long, exhausting traverse just below the summit. All of this is Dhaulagiri. And here, twice in his life, one Italian would come. His name was Simone La Terra. He was born in a place where there are almost no mountains at all, Castiglione delle Stiviere, a small town in the province of Mantua, in northern Italy, on the flat Lombard plain near the Po River, a land of vineyards, of morning fog, of a level horizon stretching all the way to the edge. To see real peaks, you have to travel away from here, and the boy who grew up among these fields one day set out, and could never bring himself to stop. Simone came to the high mountains on his own, with no family tradition behind him. First the Alps, the natural school for any Italian drawn upward. Rock, ice, long routes, nights spent on the walls. Then what lay higher and farther away, the Himalaya, the Karakoram, the Tibetan 8,000ers. He climbed in Nepal, in Pakistan, in Tibet, accumulating the thing that mountains value more than strength, experience. Those who knew him described La Terra not as a record hunter, nor as a man who pushed for the summit at any cost. Quite the opposite, methodical, careful, the kind who knows how to turn back. In a world where the loudest fame goes to the most reckless, he walked a slow, calculated path for years. By the spring when his life would be cut short, he was around 36 or 37. The sources disagree slightly here, but the exact number isn't what matters. What matters is that this was a mature, accomplished high-altitude climber, not someone facing thin air for the first time, with no idea what he'd gotten himself into. And before we tell the story of the mountain that would stop him, it's worth understanding the road he had traveled. Dhaulagiri was no accident in his life. It was a dream he had pursued for a long time, and stubbornly. And that road began thousands of kilometers from Nepal, on peaks far less famous, but no less dangerous. 2006, Tibet. Shishapangma, 8,027 meters. The first 8,000er of his life, and the start of La Terra's serious Himalayan career. Not the tallest mountain in the big league, but a threshold you have to step across to learn whether your body can survive where there's half as much oxygen as it needs. A year later, the Karakoram, Pakistan. Broad peak, 8,051 meters. Harsh, windy, demanding a completely different kind of endurance. Another year on, in 2008, Simone is back in the Karakoram, Gasherbrum 2, 8,035 meters. Two Pakistani giants in a row, two of the most logistically brutal regions on the planet. 2009, Cho Oyu, 8,188 meters. Statistically one of the most accessible, but still a genuine 8,000er that forgives no carelessness. And finally, 2011, Manaslu, 8,163 meters. A mountain almost exactly as tall as the one that would become his last. 5 summits in 5 years. Lay them out in a row, and the main thing becomes clear. These weren't chaotic lunges, no chase after check marks. A steady, calibrated trajectory of a man building himself step by step. Each new mountain added something: altitude, cold, distance, the difficulty of the approach. He didn't skip the steps, he climbed through them. By the time he came to Dhaulagiri, Simone was no longer a beginner, blinded by the romance of altitude. He knew the price of every meter above 7,000. He knew how the body behaves at the edge, how oxygen starvation deceives the mind, how vital it is to tell yourself no in time. That's why what happens next can't be written off as inexperience or bravado. And yet one mountain on his list had long remained unfinished. That very one, dazzling white. They had already met once, 5 years before the end. 2013. La Terra sets foot on the slopes of Dhaulagiri for the first time. Beside him, the Polish climber Paweł Michalski. A rope team of seasoned mountaineers, both of them understanding exactly what they're getting into. The route leads them upward, meter by meter, past ice fields and snow ridges, toward the zone where the real altitude begins. They reach roughly 7,200. The summit isn't all that far now, on the map. But the map says nothing about the thing that decides everything: the wind. Dhaulagiri switches on its true character, the very one that earned it the name Mountain of Storms. The air on the ridge turns into a wall you simply cannot walk into. Gusts so strong they knock you off your feet, tear the tent, turn any move upward into a game with death. And the two experienced climbers make the only right decision. They turn back. This needs to be said plainly. Turning around is not a defeat. 7,200, a retreat without an accident, coming down alive. That is mastery itself. The mountain wouldn't let them through, and they heard it. In climbing, knowing how to retreat is valued no less than knowing how to reach the top. Many of those 87 who stayed here forever were precisely the ones who didn't hear it in time. And so, Dhaulagiri became, for La Terra, an unsettled account. The only major mountain on his list that had told him no. For a climber of his temperament, that's no reason to grow angry or to take revenge on a summit. But it isn't easy to forget either. The mountain stayed in his plans, a calm, postponed goal. For 5 years it lay there like that. And then he went back, by the same road, to the same wall. Only this time, the story would end differently. The spring of 2018. The season in the Himalaya is only just opening. Caravans of expeditions are once again moving up the valleys of Nepal, porters, yaks, crates of equipment. Among those heading for Dhaulagiri is Simone La Terra. The expedition is organized by a local operator, Prestige Adventure, logistics, permits, base camp, support on the approach. The road to the mountain begins far below and runs up the narrow Mayagdi Kola Valley, the very one that makes Dhaulagiri so treacherous. There's no fast way, neither up nor back. Several days on foot along trails, passes, forests, and scree, before the dazzling white wall finally rises before your eyes. Base camp is set up. After that comes the work, familiar to any 8,000er. The climbers gradually fix the route, plant intermediate camps higher and higher, going up and coming down, letting the body get used to the thin air. Slow, grinding acclimatization, the kind where haste kills. For La Terra, this mountain isn't just another peak in the collection. It's an old debt he's come to repay. And somewhere inside him, there probably lives the calm confidence of an experienced man. Last time the weather got in the way, this time the luck should run better. He's not alone on the mountain in these days. The season is starting, and several teams are working the route. Among them is an international expedition whose members will later turn out to be the ones searching for Simone. For now, everything is going as it should. The camps creep upward, people acclimatize, the weather forecasts are studied every single day. And here is where the main variable of the whole story surfaces: the wind. On Dhaulagiri, the wind forecast matters more than almost anything else. A window of calm weather here is a rare thing, something you wait weeks to catch. And between the windows, the mountain lives by its own rules, and those rules are merciless to anyone caught too high at the wrong moment. Simone reaches the zone of Camp 3, the part of the route lying at around 7,000 meters. Normally, Camp 3 is pitched in one familiar, more or less sheltered spot, but this time, La Terra sets his tent below the standard point, on the ridge, at an altitude of about 6,900 meters. A ridge. The very word sounds ominous on an 8,000er. A narrow line, with the slope dropping away on both sides. An exposed, fully windswept place, where there's no rock, no fold in the terrain to hide behind from the blast. Here nothing protects the tent except its own poles and guy lines. Why exactly there? Most likely, that's how the circumstances fell out. The state of the route, the time, the weather, his remaining strength. On a mountain, decisions are often made not from the ideal, but from what's available right now. Maybe it was impossible to go higher, and going lower was too far. Maybe the ridge seemed an acceptable compromise for a single night. The precise reasoning of that evening can no longer be reconstructed today. What matters is something else. At 7,000 meters, a tent isn't a comfort. It's the only barrier between a human being and the elements. Thin synthetic walls hold in the warmth, hold off the wind, hold the very chance of living until morning. Inside, a sleeping bag, a gas stove, a thermos, all the gear of a high-altitude night. Outside, -20, -30, and blackness. Simone climbs inside and zips the entrance shut. The day is over. Ahead lies a night on the ridge, at an altitude where the body doesn't recover, but only slowly wears down. And somewhere in the darkness, the wind begins to gather strength. First a steady hum, then heavier blows. The tent shudders, the fabric snaps. The poles bend under the pressure. This isn't a catastrophe yet. This is just Dhaulagiri testing the strength of everyone who dared to spend the night on its ridge. By the night of Sunday, everything changes. What had been a strong wind in the evening turns into a hurricane. The flow of air on the ridge picks up enormous speed. At altitudes like this, the wind is no longer measured in gusts, but as a solid wall that strikes without pause. The tent stops being a shelter and becomes a sail. And at some point, the very thing happens that every person who has slept high in an exposed spot fears. One gust, the strongest of all, snatches the entire tent up, with Simone still inside. It all happens in seconds, no time to scramble out, to grab hold of anything, even to grasp what's going on. One moment, there's the familiar cramped space of a high-altitude shelter all around, the sleeping bag, the roar, the trembling walls. And the next, the fabric is torn from the ridge, and the man inside is flying down the slope of the mountain he had so badly wanted to climb. This is the very danger for which we began the whole story with the mountain itself. Mountain of Storms is no pretty nickname, it's a diagnosis. The wind here is deadly, not through an avalanche, not a collapse, not a fall into a crevasse, but through its sheer force, capable of ripping from the ridge everything that stands on it. On Dhaulagiri, it's the air itself that decides a person's fate. A fall from that height down the steep slope of an 8,000er leaves almost no chance. The tent is carried farther and farther down from the place where the camp had stood a minute earlier, and up above, on the ridge, an emptiness remains. Where there should have been the orange or yellow dot of a tent, there's only snow and wind. Contact with Simone is lost. No one yet knows what has happened. In the camps below, people hear the mountain howling and wait out the storm in their tents, never guessing that one of them is already gone from the mountain this night. Dawn comes not as relief, but as the discovery of disaster. As the light grows and the wind eases a little, someone lifts their eyes to where Simone's camp should have been. No tent, no guy lines, no equipment, no trace of an overnight stay, as if the place had never existed. The experienced ones understand it all at once. The thing they were afraid to say out loud has happened. the camp was blown away, and with it, a man. They raise the alarm. Over the radio, the word goes down, to base camp and to the other teams. La Terra is missing. His tent is gone. The word missing on an 8,000er carries more weight than anywhere else. Here you can't simply wander off and get lost. Here a disappearance almost always means one thing. And yet the people don't give up. In the mountains, the custom is to search until the very end. They start figuring out where the tent might have been carried, down which slope, how far. But the conditions are against them. The weather is still foul. The wind hasn't fully died down. Visibility is ragged. The ridge is dangerous. Every hour now works against Simone. If by some incredible chance he survived the fall, then he's lying somewhere on the slope, in bitter cold, with no shelter, at an altitude where a healthy man weakens before your eyes. At marks like these, time compresses. What would stretch over a full day down below is decided here in hours. The team understands. On their own, on foot, in weather like this, they'll cover only a small fraction of the slope. To take in the mountain from above, they need a helicopter, one that can rise to where a person can't reach and look down to the foot of the wall, where the flight of the torn-away tent may have ended. The rescue operation unfolds on 2 levels at once. Below, on the slope, members of the expedition move on foot, searching everything they can reach. They make their way along the ridgelines and gullies, peering at every dark spot on the snow, knowing that almost no hope remains of finding Simone alive. A rescue helicopter takes to the air. For Nepal, this is a familiar but always risky way of working in the mountains. The machine tries to gain altitude, to round the wall, to look into a place no one could reach on foot in any reasonable time. But here, too, the mountain doesn't give in easily. The helicopter fights the wind and the cloud. At altitudes like these, the air is thin, and it's physically hard for a rotorcraft to stay aloft. The power is at its limit. Every bit of turbulence is dangerous. The pilots come in again and again, timing the short breaks in the clouds, risking themselves for a man they most likely can no longer save. Here, Dhaulagiri's remoteness makes itself felt once more. This isn't Everest with its well-oiled infrastructure and dozens of aircraft. The Mayagdi Kola Valley is long and hard to reach. Help comes here slowly, and every flight is a separate battle with distance and altitude. The mountain seems deliberately arranged so that any disaster here costs more than it would in the busier corners of the Himalaya. The search runs at the limit of human and technical capability. The people below freeze and wear themselves out. The helicopter above burns its fuel in an uneven fight with the air. Gradually, the search zone shifts lower and lower, toward the foot of the slope down which the tent was carried in the night. The picture doesn't come clear at once. At first, nothing. Empty snow, bare ice, ragged clouds. But those searching understand. Whatever was torn from the ridge at 6,900 could not have stayed high. They need to search far lower, and there, lowest of all, the answer is finally found. The body of Simone La Terra is discovered roughly 800 meters below the place where his tent had stood. The altitude of the find is about 6,100 meters. 800 meters of vertical drop, a number that, all on its own, says more about the force of that night than any description could. This is the first fatality of the spring season of 2018 on Dhaulagiri. A grim opening of a list the mountain will go on keeping. The body is recovered from the slope and brought down, and then on to Kathmandu. Unlike many who stayed here forever, Simone was returned to his family. That much, at least. The official version is simple and terrible in its simplicity. The cause of death: a tent torn away by hurricane-force wind and a fall. Not an avalanche, not a collapse, not an error with the rope, not a failure of equipment. In the box marked cause of death, there is, in essence, a single word: weather. And here's what's important to grasp. The man who died was not a green beginner, not an overconfident amateur who'd misjudged his own strength. The man who died had climbed 5 8,000ers. Someone who read the mountains better than most and was never ashamed to turn back. His experience, his caution, his methodical care, none of it saved him. Against an element of that scale, human skill sometimes turns out to be simply out of proportion. You can guess endlessly about what might have happened had he pitched the tent somewhere else, 100 meters to the side, behind the shelter of the terrain. But those are only guesses. On a mountain, the decision about where to spend the night is made from the reality of one specific evening, not from the calm of an office. Simone chose the ridge, the mountain chose the wind, and in that collision, the man had no chance. Thousands of kilometers from the Nepalese slope, the news falls on Simone's homeland. In Italy, word of the death of their countryman from the province of Mantua spreads quickly. Castiglione dell'Estiviere, that same little town on the plain by the Po River, loses one of its own, a man who went far beyond his native fields and never came back. The Italian papers write about the tragedy in the Himalaya bluntly and harshly. The headlines flash the phrase, "killer wind." For the wider public, far removed from high-altitude climbing, such a cause sounds almost fantastical, and for that very reason, it hits all the harder. There's no villain, no gross mistake, no piece of equipment that failed. There's only the mountain and the air. In the climbing community, the conversation goes deeper. They discuss the choice of campsite, a tent on an open ridge instead of a sheltered spot. Some carefully weigh the risks. Others remind everyone that, with hindsight, it's easy to judge anyone at all. But behind the arguments, a shared, sobering thought emerges. Here, it isn't enough to know how to climb, and it isn't enough to be strong. Your main bet isn't on the slope, but on the forecast. And sometimes you lose that bet in the night, when nothing can be fixed anymore. Simone's story becomes a reminder for everyone who sees in Dhaulagiri just another box to tick on the list of 8,000ers. This mountain punishes not only daring, sometimes it punishes simple bad luck, the fact that you happened to be in the wrong place on the one night when it decided to show its character. What also remains is the image of the man himself, a methodical climber who paid the full price for his wish to finish what he had begun long ago. And there's a cruel arithmetic in his fate. One mountain, 2 attempts, and the same force between them, the air. In 13, that air forced him to retreat, and by doing so, it saved his life. In 18, it waited out one night and took that life away. The Himalaya knows many ways to kill a climber. Dhaulagiri, twice in a row, chose the very same one for Simone. The mountain that 2 centuries ago people believed to be the highest point on the planet, and then, all but forgot, has taken one more name. In this, perhaps, lies the main bitter truth about Dhaulagiri. It doesn't need Everest's fame in order to kill. It does so quietly, without loud headlines around the world, taking experienced, strong, careful people, one after another. The name of Simone La Terra has joined a long line of those stopped not by a route, not by a sheer wall, and not by their own weakness, but by the very atmosphere of the mountain. Those who did everything right and still lost to the elements. This was only the first story. The mountain we'll be speaking of further holds many more such names, people of different countries, different eras, different climbing styles. United by one thing, they went up the dazzling white mountain and never came back down. And in each of these stories, Dhaulagiri will show a new face of its danger. Here, on the 7th highest peak in the world, calm is never a promise. It's only a pause between gusts of wind. On the 28th of April, 1969, 8 men are crossing a glacier at an altitude of about 5,300 meters. Above them hangs a tower of blue ice. Their leader, Boyd Everett, has calculated the passage through this dangerous zone down to the minute, calculating everything as simply how he operates. Within a few seconds, 7 of those 8 will vanish beneath an avalanche that obeys no calculation at all. Their bodies have never been found. What does the one man the mountain spared feel as he searches the ice alone? Ice that won't yield even to an ice axe. And why is it precisely he who, years later, will climb K2 without oxygen? This is the story of one of the worst disasters in American mountaineering, and of one incredible survivor. Boyd Everett Jr. doesn't look like the kind of person you picture when you think of those who conquer Himalayan walls. He's 36, a financial analyst from Wall Street. He wears a suit, knows his way around securities, and graduated from Harvard. By day, he tallies the profits and risks of other people's money. And on his vacations, he heads off to places where the price of a mistake is no longer measured in dollars. He comes to the mountains in 1957 and quickly becomes one of the most level-headed climbers of his generation. Everett isn't the type to take summits by storm and rely on luck. He's methodical almost to the point of pedantry. He draws up schedules, counts the days, checks supplies, thinks through every stretch of the route. Where others trust their intuition, he trusts the table and the calculation. This approach earns him serious achievements. Everett climbs the 4 highest peaks of North America. In 1962, he makes the first ascent of the southeast spur of Denali, the highest point on the continent. These aren't random successes. They're the result of the same cold discipline he brings to his financial work. Over time, Everett takes on something almost no American climber of that era attempts. He sits down and writes a practical guide to organizing large Himalayan expeditions. How to calculate the load, how to set up camps, how to lead a team at altitude. For many of his countrymen, this book becomes a constant reference. And so, Everett transforms from simply a climber into a man who teaches others how to survive and win on the highest mountains on the planet. In the American Alpine Club, he's respected for exactly that combination: boldness of vision and soberness of execution. When Everett puts together a team, people come to him eagerly. Alongside a leader like that, it feels like everything has been worked out. And in 1969, he gathers his people around a big new goal. A man used to keeping everything under control prepares for a climb where the leading role will be played by something that no calculation can ever account for. And yet, Dhaulagiri isn't on the agenda at all to begin with. Everett is aiming somewhere else entirely, at the Karakoram, at the harsh Pakistani giants. First at K2, the second highest 8,000er in the world. Then he considers Malu biting, a difficult and spectacular peak in the same region. It's for these goals that he assembles the team, works out the logistics, prepares the gear. But bureaucracy turns out to be a wall no lower than one of ice. The permits for the Pakistani peak stall. Negotiations drag on for months. No answer comes. The season's window slips away. For a man who has everything planned out by the day, this is a trial worse than bad weather. The schedule collapses not because of the mountains, but because of someone else's offices. And then an unexpected door opens. Nepal, which for years kept its peaks closed, is once again allowing ascents. Everett pivots in an instant. He files an application for Dhaulagiri and gets his permit in just 3 weeks. By the standards of Himalayan bureaucracy, that's almost lightning fast. But speed has its price. The permit is issued for one specific line, the Southeast Ridge. And at that point, that ridge hasn't been climbed by anyone. The team isn't getting a well-worn path with known dangers. It's getting a blank page. No one before them knows where an avalanche lies, in wait here, where unstable ice hangs, where the ridge is deceptively easy and where it's deadly. And here's the irony of fate. A man who strives to calculate everything sets out on a route about which there's almost nothing to calculate in advance. All the preparation for the Karakoram is reworked for a different mountain, a different valley, a different terrain, on a tight timeline, almost on the fly. Everett accepts the challenge. The team switches to Dhaulagiri, the 7th highest peak on the planet, and sets its sights on climbing it by an unconquered ridge. On paper, it's all doable. Strong people, a well-thought-out schedule, a clear line. The reality of the mountain, as so often happens, will turn out to be arranged otherwise. For this venture, Everett assembles one of the strongest American teams of its time, 10 climbers, and behind nearly every name, serious experience and reputation. Al Red goes as his deputy, a man Everett can lean on in a hard moment. There's a doctor of their own, Bill Ross. At high altitude, that's not a luxury but a necessity. Alongside is Vin Homan, an experienced high-altitude climber who knows the cost of every 1,000 meters. With them are Dave Seidman, Paul Gerhard, Jim Janney, Jim Morrissey, Jeff Duenwald, each of them a notable figure in climbing back home. And among them, the youngest, 26-year-old Lou Reichhardt. Next to the older men, he's still a newcomer to the Himalayas, a scientist for whom the mountains are a serious passion. No one then suspects that it's precisely he who will be handed a role you couldn't wish on anyone. The team is reinforced by high-altitude Sherpas, the people without whom large Himalayan expeditions are simply unthinkable. Among them are Pemba Futar, Tenzing, Mingma Norbu. These aren't porters along for the ride. They're full participants in the climb, moving through the most dangerous zone on equal footing with everyone else. When a group like this sets out on the route, it looks from the outside as if everything needed for success is there. Strong bodies, cool heads, experience on different continents. A doctor, a proven leader with a reputation as a strategist. This is a team that climbing circles frankly envy. and the plan matches the people. To climb a difficult, unconquered ridge at a measured pace, on schedule, without unnecessary risk, exactly the way Everett likes it. Everyone knows their place on the rope and their task on each stretch. It's just that, in the mountains, the strength of a team and the quality of a plan are far from everything. Sometimes the outcome depends on who happens to be standing at which point on the slope and in which second. And that second is already close. In early April of 1969, the expedition leaves the United States, a flight across half the planet. And by the 15th of April, the team is flying from Kathmandu to Pokhara, the starting point for the push toward the mountain. And then begins the thing that sets Dhaulagiri apart from many other peaks, the long, exhausting trek to the foot of the mountain through the Nepalese valleys. Base camp is set up at an altitude of about 4,500 meters, on the east glacier of Dhaulagiri. From here, the team begins its reconnaissance, feeling out the line of ascent, placing intermediate points higher up the route. Everything goes according to Everett's script, gradually, without haste, with acclimatization in mind. And then the mountain speaks for the first time. On the 22nd of April, Al Red is suddenly struck down by severe altitude sickness. This is no minor ailment. He develops pulmonary edema and cerebral edema, the two most dangerous conditions at altitude. The man loses clarity of mind, and without a quick descent, at that height, this is deadly. The team acts fast. Reed is urgently evacuated down the slope, toward denser air, where his body can claw its way back. His life literally hangs by a thread, and the descent becomes a race against time. Red is saved, but the cost is obvious. The expedition loses its deputy leader even before reaching the key section of the ridge. The team has thinned out, and the mountain has already shown that it has no intention of simply letting outsiders through. For Everett, this is a signal he knows how to read. Altitude is merciless even to the well-prepared, but sickness is at least an enemy you can understand. You can see it, you can anticipate it, there's a tactic against it, and there's the descent. Far more dangerous is the thing that comes without warning and leaves no time for a decision. And it's this the team will face in a few days, on a deceptively harmless field of snow. The 28th of April arrives. The day begins like an ordinary working day on the route, crossing the glacier, ferrying gear higher, moving along on schedule. The group comes out onto a wide snow cirque, a gentle bowl of ice and snow at an altitude of about 5,300 meters. From the outside, this place looks almost peaceful. No sheer walls, no dizzying drops underfoot. But a climber who reads the terrain sees something else. Above the section, a little off to the side, looms a triangular cliff of blue ice. This is a serac, an ice tower, a chunk of glacier slowly creeping forward and left hanging over the slope. Towers like these live their own lives. They stand motionless for years and then collapse in a single second, with no wind, no jolt, no visible cause at all. Everett understands this. The zone beneath the serac is a dangerous place, and the team doesn't linger in it without need. He calculates the passage the way he's used to calculating everything. The time under threat is reduced to a minimum. The group crosses the section quickly and in tight formation. On paper, this is the right tactic, the very one described in his own guide. The group moves through the zone beneath the tower, crossing a wide crevasse. 5 Americans and 2 Sherpas go in a tight line, measuring out each step over the familiar snow. The blue ice hangs above them, but in this minute it seems like part of the scenery, not a threat. Lou Reichard at this moment happens to be a little off to the side, at the very edge of the group, not in its core. There's no special calculation behind this. It just worked out that way. Someone goes first, someone last, someone a step off to the side. In a few seconds, this very thing, who is standing where on the slope in this instant, will divide the men into those who will leave the mountain and those who will remain in it forever. Everett's calculations took almost everything into account. Everything except the single most important second of that morning. The tower collapses without a single warning. A huge mass of blue ice tears loose and comes down with that dull roar that climbers recognize before they have time to understand what they're hearing. The avalanche cuts a swath across the snow cirque about 30 meters wide. This isn't snow dust you can wait out by turning away. These are tons of compacted ice, hurtling down and sweeping away everything in their path. The avalanche instantly fills that very crevasse the group has just crossed, and buries the people walking across it. It all happens in seconds. 5 Americans and 2 Sherpas vanish into the flow of ice almost simultaneously. Less time passes between everything's fine and everything's over than it takes to cry out. Lou Reichart, who lived through that instant, would later find words for it that are hard to forget. He called what happened a scene of indescribable fury, written in white. In that short phrase is everything. The scale of the collapse, its blind, impersonal force, and the very color in which this glacier is painted. The scale of the slide leaves no chance for anyone caught at its center. Against a mass of ice like that, experience, strength, and reflexes are all powerless. There's nothing to grab onto, nowhere to leap aside, nothing to set against it. The strongest team, the one others envied, loses 7 of its best in a single instant. And here's the most terrible thing about that day. Everett calculated everything correctly. He really did reduce the time under the tower to a minimum, and he really did lead the group exactly the way sound tactics prescribe. But a serac doesn't obey schedules and timetables. It falls when it falls. And that morning, its second coincided with the one when people were walking below. Of the 8 who ended up in the slide zone, 1 survived. 26-year-old Lou Reichart stays alive only because in that fatal second, he's standing at the very edge of the avalanche, not in its core, a few meters to the side, and his name would have been on that same list. When the ice begins to move, Reichart manages to do the one right thing. He dives into a small fold in the slope, into that crease in the terrain that gives at least a little cover from the flow. It isn't shelter in the full sense of the word, more the shadow of shelter, a tiny dip able to deflect part of the blow. The stream of ice debris catches him a glancing blow, on the tangent. Under a different alignment of events, it could have ended differently. But Reichart holds on. He presses himself into the slope and waits out something that is almost impossible to wait out. And then comes the silence, that special deafening silence that takes the place of the roar. Reichart raises his head and finds himself alone on a frozen field of debris. A moment ago, 7 comrades were around him. Now there's ice. The chaos of blocks stretches across an area the size of a football field, several meters thick, and somewhere beneath those blocks is the rest of the team. He doesn't leave right away. For about an hour, Reichart searches the debris alone, clambering over blocks of ice, listening, peering, hoping for the impossible. He looks for any sign of life, any single chance to help someone. But the debris is silent. Finding no one, Reichart makes a hard decision. There's no reason to stay here any longer. Alone, he can do nothing. He has to descend to base camp, raise the alarm, call those who remain below. And he begins the descent, the only survivor, carrying down news you wouldn't wish on anyone. The word reaches base camp, and that same evening, the remaining members of the expedition set out upward, toward the site of the slide. In the days that follow, the search continues. People return to the debris again and again, examining every part of it. What they see takes away hope faster than any words. The avalanche field is a solid mass of compacted ice, stretching for dozens of meters and reaching down some 6 meters deep. Somewhere beneath that mass lie their comrades, but there is no physical way to reach them. The ice after a slide is nothing like loose snow you can dig out with a shovel. Falling from a height and crushing together, it freezes into a monolith, hard as stone. The blocks are so dense that even an ice axe won't bite into them. The climber's main tool, the one used in ordinary conditions to cut steps and break a path, here it only bounces helplessly off the surface. The rescuers do what they can. They search the debris, take apart what will give way, look for any trace, but all they find is torn, mangled gear, scraps of what their comrades carried on themselves. The force of the avalanche was such that sturdy mountaineering equipment was blown to shreds. No trace of the men themselves can be found. Gradually comes a realization there's no escaping. Reichart would later put it honestly and plainly. There was no reasonable basis left for hope. This isn't giving up on trying. It's the sober conclusion of men who have done everything within human power and run up against a wall they can't break through. Recovering their comrades is impossible, not from a lack of will, courage, or strength, but from the very nature of what happened. The mountain didn't merely take 7 men. It sealed them in armor of ice, against which a human being is simply powerless. And the team faces a task harder than any climb, to admit that bringing the dead home will not be possible. After the search, only the joyless business at hand remains. The team spends about another week on the mountain, not for the climb, that's out of the question now, but to gather the abandoned gear and break down the camps. The decision to end the expedition comes of its own accord. To continue after a loss like this is impossible. 7 remain in the glacier. Decades later, they have still never been recovered. The mountain took them in and did not give them back. Among those who stayed forever is Boyd Everett himself, the man whose methodical mind and sober calculation could not turn aside the serac's blind blow. And this is the hardest truth of that expedition. There was no gross error, no recklessness, no breaking of their own rules. There was a competent leader, a strong team, the right tactics, and one random second in which the ice came down exactly where the men were walking. 7 in a single avalanche. This is one of the worst disasters in the history of American Himalayan mountaineering. An entire team of the best vanishes in an instant, and that loss stays in the memory of the climbing community for a long time. And Dhaulagiri, that season of 1969, seems unable to stop. The mountain takes other climbers too, members of a second expedition working on its slopes. The year becomes one of the most tragic in the peak's history, a black mark even on its grim tally. The 7th highest peak on the planet, long accustomed to collecting its toll, takes especially much that year. And for those who later study its history, the name Dhaulagiri will be inseparably bound to that ice tower and to the 7 men it carried away on one spring morning. Lou Reichard returns home, the only survivor of those who stood beneath the ice tower. He's 26, and he brings back with him something you can't check as luggage or leave behind in the mountains: the memory of what he saw. A thing like that doesn't pass without a trace. Reichard himself admits that what he lived through stays with him for a long time. After that morning on the glacier, you can't simply close the chapter and go on living as before. The trauma of that scene written in white holds on for years. But Reichard does something unexpected with it. You'd think that after something like that, he would leave the big mountains forever. The price came out too high. Many people hang up their ice axe after far smaller shocks. But he stays. He forges the pain and the memory into perseverance, into a calm and stubborn resolve. The proof comes within just 4 years. In 1973, Reichard returns to Dhaulagiri 1, the very mountain that took 7 of his comrades. He goes again, deliberately, toward the summit at whose foot his friends remained. This time, the team chooses a different line, the northeast ridge, the classic path to the summit. And on the 12th of May, Reichard stands on the highest point of Dhaulagiri. Beside him on the summit are John Roskelley, who would later become one of the legends of American mountaineering, and the Sherpa Nawang Samden. This ascent is hard to call simply a sporting success. The mountain that once nearly killed him and took 7 people close to him is now conquered by his own hand. Reichard returns to where he lived through the worst and goes all the way. For most people, a summit like that would have made a worthy finale to an entire climbing life. For Reichard, it's just one of the steps on a path that's only beginning to gain altitude. From here, the biography of the lone survivor reads almost like a script that's hard to believe. The man whom chance left alive beneath the ice tower turns into one of the most outstanding mountaineers of his country. In 1978, Reichard finds himself on the slopes of K2, the 2nd highest peak on the planet, which many consider more dangerous than Everest itself. And there an episode takes place that became legend. High on the mountain, at around 8,000 meters, his oxygen system fails. There's a puncture in the hose, and the apparatus turns into useless dead weight. Almost anyone in his place would have turned back. Reichard takes off the now useless equipment and goes up without supplemental oxygen. That day, together with Jim Wickwire, he reaches the summit of K2, and he enters history as the first person to climb this mountain without oxygen support. A failure at altitude turned into a record that will be remembered for decades. And this still isn't the end of the road. In 1983, Reichard makes yet another outstanding climb. He's the first to scale the Kongshung face of Everest, one of the most difficult and forbidding bastions of the highest mountain in the world. And so, he becomes the first American to climb both Everest and K2. And all of this, remarkably, is only one side of his life. Away from the mountains, Lou Reichard is a serious scientist, a renowned neurobiologist, a professor who devoted himself to studying how the human brain is built and how it works. The same mind that once helped him survive and not break, he turns toward one of the most difficult scientific problems there is. And so, the arc closes that began on an April morning on the Dhaulagiri glacier. 7 remained in the mountain forever, and the one man it spared lived a life that seemed to hold within it the fates of all the others, on the highest summits of the earth, and in the deepest questions about the human mind. What is a man supposed to do when his best friend dies in his arms at an altitude from which the body can never be carried down? In the autumn of 1993, the New Zealander Rob Hall stands above a glacial crevasse on Dhaulagiri with a rope in his hands. On the other end of that rope is Gary Ball, his partner in a legendary climbing duo, the man with whom he had circled the entire globe and once spoke live on air from the summit of Everest. High-altitude pulmonary edema above 7,000 meters had proven stronger than either of them, and now Hall has to open his hands. This is the story of a friendship cut short by a mountain and of what happened to it 10 years later. Gary Ball was born in 1953, on islands that themselves stand at the edge of the inhabited world. New Zealand gave him mountains right on his doorstep, sharp, ice-covered, demanding. By the start of the 90s, he had become one of the most famous climbers in the country. That fame he earned over years of hard work in the field. Ball was no armchair dreamer. He spent years in Antarctica, where the cold and the emptiness test a man harder than any peak. In the 76 and 77 season, he worked as a field guide and survival instructor at Scott Base. Later, at the end of the 70s, he set off with an expedition to Victoria Land. There he learned the most important craft of a high-altitude climber, staying alive in places where nature never intended it. Later, both a glacier and a mountain peak in that same Antarctica would be named after him. Back home, in his own country, he climbed Aoraki, more often called Mount Cook, 26 times. For its day, that was a record. The mountain is fickle and dangerous, and every ascent of it is a story in itself. Ball came to know it the way you come to know the character of someone close to you. But the most important thing in his life turned out not to be a summit. The most important thing was another man. Rob Hall, also a New Zealander, also a guide, forged from the same stock. They met as professionals and became closer than brothers. On the rope, the life of one literally hung in the hands of the other. And from that grew a special kind of trust, the kind that is born only where a mistake costs you everything. In 1989, they made their first attempt together on the highest point on the planet. Everest, that time, would not let them in. But after that failure, the two partners only held to each other more tightly. They already knew that from now on, they would go as a pair. The next year turned 2 stubborn New Zealanders into national heroes. In 1990, Ball and Hall took on a project that takes an ordinary person's breath away. The 7 highest summits on every continent of the planet, and all of it in 7 months. 1 crown for each landmass, with no long pauses, almost without a break. On the 10th of May, 1990, Ball stands on the summit of Everest. Beside him are Hall and Peter Hillary, the son of the very man who first set foot on the roof of the world. But they do something no one before them had done. From the summit itself, from an altitude where there is almost no air, they make a satellite connection and speak live on New Zealand television, in prime time, with the whole country in front of their screens. After that, the climb stopped being the private business of a few daredevils. An entire nation was following it. A voice from the summit of Everest, sounding out in the living rooms of ordinary homes. In the early 90s, that was almost science fiction. After that, the pair gathered the remaining crowns one by one. Kilimanjaro in Africa, Elbrus in Europe, Aconcagua in South America. Each peak with its own character, its own weather, its own traps. They moved at a pace that wears out even bodies used to altitude, but they did not slow down. The final point was the Vinson Massif, an icy giant deep inside Antarctica. The continent Ball had known better than most since his youth. When they climbed it, the circle closed. A crown for each landmass, a record-breaking result for the time, one that seemed almost impossible. Their country answered with recognition. Ball received the New Zealand 1990 commemorative medal. But more precious to the two friends than any medals was something else. They realized that as a team, they could handle almost anything. That confidence would soon push them toward a far riskier step. At the start of 1991, the romance of the Great Mountains turned into a business with an office and contracts. In Christchurch, Ball and Hall registered a company with a telling name, Adventure Consultants. The idea was bold for its time, to lead paying clients to places where before only a select few had gone alone, to the 8,000-meter peaks, and above all, to Everest. The idea seemed almost blasphemous to the old school of mountaineering. For decades, the world's highest mountains had been the territory of heroes and fanatics, not people with a checkbook. Ball and Hall were among the first to build a trade on it. They became pioneers of commercial-guided climbs in the Himalayas, opening the way for an entire industry that would grow in the years that followed. The loud fame of that marathon across the continents worked for the young firm better than any advertising. The name of the two New Zealanders drew clients all on its own. People wanted to go with the very men who had already proven they knew how to come back alive. The partners split the roles the way it had taken shape between them over the years. Hall took on strategy, negotiations, organization, the head of the expedition. Ball was responsible for the field side and the training, for what happened on the slope itself, where decisions are made with muscle and nerve, not on paper. Together, they covered the whole spectrum, from the office to the death zone. In 1992, Ball climbed Everest again. This was his second ascent of the highest point on the planet. And for a guide with a growing firm, that kind of experience was worth more than gold. Every successful climb strengthened the reputation of Adventure Consultants. Very quickly, the company became one of the most visible operators in high-altitude mountaineering. The two friends had everything in their hands: a name, a business, and a clear future. But in the body of one of them, a weakness was already growing, one that no one yet suspected. In the summer of 1992, the pair set off for a mountain feared even by those who have conquered Everest. K2, the second highest peak in the world, but far meaner in character than the first. There are no easy paths here, and the death statistics on it are more frightening than any story. Ball and Hall went there together, as always. At an altitude of around 8,300 meters, disaster struck Ball. His lungs began to fail, a severe high-altitude illness setting in. And all of it happened in the death zone, where the human body does not recover, but only breaks down with every passing hour. Ball's life hung by a thread. At such an altitude, saving a man who is suffocating is almost impossible, the air too thin, the exhausted body too heavy to drag down. But the strongest of climbers happened to be nearby. Hall and a whole group of outstanding mountaineers took charge of bringing Ball down. Dan Mazur, Scott Fisher, Ed Viesturs, Neil Beidelman. Names that would echo through the history of the mountains, and not always happily. Ball was hauled down and saved. He survived. But that ordeal cost more than one miraculously won descent. It was now clear. Ball's body was vulnerable to altitude sickness. What for others ends in heavy breathing threatened, for him, to turn into mortal danger. The mountain had sent him a warning, direct and unmistakable. An experienced climber should have heard that signal, and perhaps Ball did hear it, but he did not retreat. For a man who had built his life and his business around the great mountains, walking away from altitude meant giving up on himself. A year later, the same affliction would catch up with him again. Only the next time, there would be no group of rescuers nearby, just one friend and a slope from which there is no descending in time. The autumn of 1993 found the partners already at a new goal. This time they chose Dhaulagiri, the seventh highest peak in the world, a mountain whose name sounds less often in the West than Everest or K2, but whose danger is in no way less for that. Sharp, unpredictable weather and the constant threat of avalanches make it one of the cruelest 8,000-meter peaks on Earth. The route the partners chose was the classic one, along the northeast ridge. It is the usual line on the mountain, the one most climbers had followed, but here, usual does not mean safe. The ridge runs high, open to every wind, and any change of weather on it strikes a man with full force. The most alarming thing about the whole undertaking was the timing. Ball was heading for an 8,000-meter peak less than a year after barely surviving on K2. His lungs, which had once failed at great altitude, were once again being sent to a place where there is almost no air. Anyone who followed the mountains closely might have grown wary. Later, an editor of Mountaineering Chronicles would write plainly, After what happened on K2, one should have thought long and hard before going back up so high. But for the two friends, a mountain had long ago stopped being anything special. An 8,000-meter peak was a workplace for them, as familiar and understood as a workshop is for a craftsman. They climbed together, roped as a pair, exactly as they had done for years. The trust between them was absolute. Each knew the other would never abandon him, no matter what happened. In that confidence lay both their strength and their weakness. Together, they passed through places where a lone climber would have broken. But the habit of risk dulls caution, and the mountain they were heading for gave no discounts, not for friendship, not for experience, not for past victories. It was waiting for them at the very altitude where Gary Ball's body had once already faltered. The third camp stood at an altitude of around 7,350 meters. Here, in the thin air just below the summit, Ball's body broke down again. The altitude sickness that had nearly killed him a year earlier on K2 returned, as if the mountain had remembered an old acquaintance and caught up with him on a new slope. This time, it was high-altitude pulmonary edema. It is one of the most treacherous conditions in the mountains. The lungs, which are meant to fill with air, gradually fill with fluid instead. Breathing becomes harder and harder, strength melts away, and there is less and less oxygen in the blood. And the higher you are, the faster this process runs. There is no cure for such a thing at altitude. Neither pills nor an oxygen bottle will hold the edema back for long. The only real salvation is descent, and the faster, the better. Every 100 meters down restores density to the air and gives the lungs a chance to cope. But bringing an exhausted man down from over 7,000 meters is a task for which there may not be enough time, nor enough strength. Ball's condition worsened hour by hour. What had begun as labored breathing turned into a fight for every single breath. Beside him was Hall, and he understood better than anyone what all of this threatened. He had already seen his friend in this state on K2, and he remembered how thin the line is beyond which there is no way back. A year earlier on K2, a whole team of the strongest climbers had been standing nearby. On Dhaulagiri, everything was different. The altitude and the illness were the same, but the people and the resources were far fewer. Time, on which everything here depended, was working relentlessly against them. With every passing hour, the window for rescue narrowed, and Hall could feel it in his skin. The rescue began the only way it could, downward. Hall and the other members of the expedition tried to bring Ball down to a lower camp, closer to the denser air that might give his lungs a chance. On paper, it was simple. Lose altitude and the illness would retreat. In reality, it was exhausting, almost impossible work. Lowering a man who can barely stand on his own legs down the icy slope of an 8,000-meter peak is a task that drains the strength of everyone at once. Every meter was won through struggle. Ball, weakened by the edema, could not walk on his own, and he was, in essence, dragged and belayed downward, meter by meter, along a ridge where one wrong step costs everyone their lives. They did everything within human power. Hall clung to hope. They had managed to pull him out once. Maybe it would work this time too. But this time, the illness had gone too far and too fast. The edema had outrun them. No matter how many meters they descended, Ball's lungs could no longer cope. On the 6th of October, 1993, Gary Ball died. He was 40 years old, an age at which a climber has experience, strength, and a whole life still ahead of him. He faded in essence in the arms of his closest friend, the very man with whom he had gone around the entire world, climbed 7 summits, and built a shared business. Hall did everything he could. He lowered him, hauled him, fought for every breath of his friends to the very last. And still, it was not enough. There are altitudes at which even the most desperate devotion and the greatest experience are powerless against physiology. The mountain proved stronger than the will of 2 men used to winning, and now Hall faced a task that is taught in no mountaineering school. What to do with a friend's body up there, where it cannot be carried down? To bring him down to people, to his country, to his family, was too high, too dangerous, too dear a price. And Hall made a decision that would stay with him to the end of his days, to commit his friend to the mountain itself, to bury him where he had spent the best years of his life, in a glacial crevasse on Dhaulagiri. In this mournful rite, Hall was not alone. Beside him were his companions, among them Jan Arnold and Helen Wilton, people from his inner circle. They found a deep crevasse just above base camp and prepared to lower the body into it. The ice was to become for their friend both a grave and a keeper. Ball's body was tied with rope and slowly lowered down into the blue darkness of the rift. And at a certain moment, Hall had to do the very thing against which his whole being rebelled. Open his hands, let go of the rope, allow the mountain to take his friend forever. Later, he would say it plainly to the press. To let go of that rope, Hall admitted, was one of the hardest things he had ever done in his life. And behind those words was everything that friendship had meant to him. Ball was not a business partner to him, nor a climbing partner in the technical sense. This was the man with whom Hall had gone around the whole world, spoken from the summit of Everest, built a dream, and shared every risk. The mountain, to which they had both given so much, took Gary Ball into its eternal ice. At the very altitude where he had felt more alive than anywhere else on Earth, that is where he remained. For Hall, it was the end of an entire era. The partnership that had seemed unbreakable was severed on the icy slope of Dhaulagiri, and he had to go on alone, carrying a weight he would never set down. The journey home became a return to a business dreamed up for two, but now belonging to one. Adventure Consultants was left without half of its soul. The company they had conceived as a shared enterprise of two friends, Hall now had to lead alone. He did not abandon what he had started. He did not close the firm or walk away from the mountains. Hall carried on what they had built together. He led clients up Everest and other great peaks. He held the standard of one of the leading operators in high-altitude mountaineering. On the surface, business went on as usual, and from the outside, it seemed the company was still doing fine. That calm was only on the surface. The shadow of the autumn of 1993 followed Hall on every expedition, into every base camp, onto every slope. He knew something you cannot read in any book, what it is to bring down a dying friend and not make it in time, to let go of the rope and hear the ice take the man with whom you had crossed half the world. That experience perhaps made him more cautious and more humane than many of his colleagues. Hall understood the price of the mountains not in theory. He had paid it himself with his greatest loss. Every client he led upward was, to him, a responsibility measured against that very crevasse on Dhaulagiri. And yet, the trade remained the same. Altitude does not forgive even the most experienced, and the one who leads people up there walks the edge himself. Hall chose not to retreat. He went on living for the mountains, the very ones that had taken his friend. Here both the strength of his character and his tragedy came together. A man who had been through such a thing could have walked away from the great heights forever. Hall stayed faithful to his work and to the mountains to the end. And that choice, a few years later, would lead him to his own reckoning on the most famous summit in the world. Less than 3 years pass. In the spring of 1996, Hall is back on Everest, on the very mountain where he and Ball had once spoken live, on air, and felt like kings of the world. Only now he was leading a commercial group alone, without the man who for years had watched his back. That climb would go down in history as one of the most terrible disasters of Everest. On the descent from the summit, a brutal storm engulfed the group. Hall stayed high on the mountain with a dying client, refused to abandon him, and was no longer able to descend himself. He died in the death zone, having acted the way a true guide would. That tragedy would later become the basis for books and a major film, and people would speak of it for decades. But behind the loud story of 1996, there is a quiet rhyme that few people notice. The two friends who founded Adventure Consultants both remained in the mountains. Ball, in the icy crevasse of Dhaulagiri in the autumn of '93. Hall, on the slope of Everest in the spring of '96. The one who buried and the one who was buried departed the same way, at the altitude they loved more than life. In that coincidence there is no mysticism and no cruel fate. There is only the harsh logic of the trade they had chosen. High-altitude mountaineering gives a person a feeling for which many are ready to risk everything. And it takes its payment for that, making no exceptions, not for beginners, not for legends. In the story of Ball and Hall's partnership, this duality is visible as nowhere else. A great friendship, great victories, a shared business, and a shared fate for the two of them. And still, the story of Gary Ball does not end there. Dhaulagiri kept his secret for exactly 10 years before it decided to reveal it. November 2003. On the slope of the mountain, the body of Gary Ball was found. 8,000-meter peaks almost never do such a thing, but this one gave back its own. The remains were come upon by French specialists working on Dhaulagiri. The ice into which the body had once been lowered had not stood still over the decade. A glacier lives its own slow life. It flows, it shifts, and over time it carries back to the surface what it once swallowed. And so Ball's body, hidden in the crevasse, in time came up onto the surface, as if the mountain, after 10 years, had decided to return the man to people. For the family, it was a shock, and at the same time, a chance. After the discovery, Ball's relatives began to prepare for a reburial, set for 2004. The man who had remained high in the mountains now had the chance to find peace at last among those close to him. And so, one of the most human tragedies of Dhaulagiri came full circle. In the end, the story of Gary Ball turned out not to be about storming a summit, nor about a record. It is about friendship entrusted to a rope and about the price paid by those who live for altitude. Two New Zealanders crossed an entire world together. They spoke from the roof of the planet, built a shared dream, and believed their partnership could handle anything. The mountain agreed only in part. It gave them fame, and it took them both, one sooner, the other later. What remains is an image stronger than any numbers or dates, a deep crevasse of ice beneath the summit, a taut rope, and a man who has to open his hands and let go of his best friend forever. Hall called it one of the hardest things he ever did in his life, and the mountain that took Gary Ball 10 years later quietly gave him back, as if to remind us that in the heights nothing is ever lost, not people, and not the memory of them. The 6th of October, 2024, at roughly 7,600 meters, 5 Russian climbers set out for the summit of Dhaulagiri. At 11 in the morning comes their last contact. Then, the radio goes silent. And a little earlier, a 6th member of the team, completely worn out, had turned back. And that choice saved his life. Why did 5 of the most experienced athletes, each with hundreds of ascents behind him, vanish all at once on the long traverse below the summit? What did the helicopter spot 700 meters lower? And how did a single decision to give up the goal separate one man from death? This is the story of a team that came to the mountain honestly and traveling light, and of a night after which only one of them came home. In the autumn of 2024, a strong team from Russia approaches the foot of the 7th highest peak on Earth. There are 6 of them, and not one is there by chance. The group is led by Alexander Dusheko, head of the Mountaineering Federation of the Leningrad region, a man who for many across the country was the very face of organized mountain sport. Alongside him are Oleg Kruglov, Vladimir Chistikov, Mikhail Nosenko, Dmitry Shpilovoy, and Valery Shamalo. Each of them has several hundred ascents behind him. These are athletes of the very highest level, men who know the mountains from the inside. They choose the most honest and the most brutal way to climb. Alpine style, that means no oxygen bottles, no Sherpas to fix the ropes and carry the loads, no caravans of porters. Everything a man needs he carries on his own back, and he climbs on his own lungs. Above 8,000 meters there is half as much air as down below, and every single step takes the toll of several. To refuse oxygen here is to deliberately strip away your last safety line. At that moment, they are the only team on the entire mountain. On crowded Everest, long lines of people stretch toward the summit, and in case of trouble, there is always someone nearby. Here there is an empty slope and 6 people who can count on no one but each other. Alpine style is beautiful precisely because of that independence. You come light, fast, and clean. But if something goes wrong high up on the route, there is nowhere to turn for help. No neighboring tent, no other rope team. The team understands this. They have climbed this way many times before and come back. Their experience is leading them higher, up to where the mountain itself begins to set the rules. At the high camp, the team prepares for the final push, the shortest and most dangerous stretch of the whole climb. At such altitudes, the summit window only opens in the dark. By day, the sun warms the slopes, the snow turns loose and slides underfoot. By night, the frost locks the ferns solid, and it holds your weight far better. So they set out for the summit at night by the light of headlamps and come back down in daylight. Valery Shamalo is an international class master of sport from St. Petersburg. He is 59. Over a long life in the mountains, he has learned to listen to his own body better than any instrument. And on this night, his body gives a signal. His strength is running out. He feels worse than he should for a push like this, and the very thought of going up in the dark along an iced-over ridge strikes him as too risky. He knows a simple truth. The mountain is not going anywhere, but a man has only one life. No summit is worth staying on forever. He does not leave in silence. Shyamala tells his teammates honestly about his doubts, shares his worry about the night ascent. But on a rope team, each man makes his own decision. The 5 feel they have enough strength to keep going, and they climb on. Shyamala turns around and begins the descent to camp alone. At the time, it looks like an ordinary choice. One member dropped out because of how he felt. That happens on any serious route. No one treats it as a farewell. But a few hours later, that fork in the dark will become the line between 2 outcomes. 5 of them head off into the night toward the summit. One descends to the tents, not yet knowing that he will never see his friends alive again. By dawn, the 5 are already high on the route. Ahead lies the section feared more than any other here, the long traverse right below the ridge. This is not a climb straight up, but a long passage along the slope, where you move sideways above the abyss, the mountain looming over you on one side, and emptiness dropping away on the other. Here, any misstep costs dearly. It is exactly traverses like this that make this peak one of the most treacherous of all the 8,000ers. There is nowhere here to simply stop and wait it out. At 11 in the morning, the group radios in. Their voices sound matter of fact. The climb is going as planned. This is the last time anyone hears them. After that, the radio falls silent. No calls, no short signals, no scheduled check-in as promised. Nothing. At first, it is blamed on dead batteries and difficult terrain. On a climb, the radio link breaks constantly, and a gap of a few hours is no cause for panic. But the hours pass, and the mountain stays silent. The weather up high changes the way it only can here. A gale slams into the ridge. It comes out of nowhere, sudden, carrying squalls of snow with it. On an open traverse, a gust like that is extremely dangerous. Standing up against it and anchoring yourself to the slope is all but impossible. Night comes, then a new day, and there is still no contact. One missed check-in can still be explained, but silence stretching over a full day can no longer be explained by anything. In the camp, where Shyamala waits after his descent, and far below at home, where loved ones follow every piece of news, an understanding slowly sets in. 5 experienced people stay out of contact this long for only one reason. Hope still holds on, but standing right beside it now is the thing no one wants to say out loud. When it becomes clear that no one will be climbing back up under their own power, aviation steps in. A rescue helicopter flies along the upper part of the route, circling the slopes where the group should have passed. From the air, the mountain looks deceptively calm. A white field, rocks, the ridge. But it is precisely from that height that the pilot and rescuers find what they were searching for and what they feared. The bodies of the 5 climbers lie at about 7,100 meters. According to the preliminary version, the group fell as a rope team from roughly 7,600, from that very traverse below the summit. The difference in height is around 500 meters down a steep slope dropping away beneath them. Behind these figures lies the nature of working on a rope. On such steepness, it is nearly impossible to hold a man who has fallen, and the shared rope binds the fates of everyone on it. That is why in situations like this, the whole group often shares one fate. As for what triggered the fall, here the versions diverge. The main one among the experts is simple. The climbers may have been blown off the open traverse by the wind, by that same gale that hit the ridge in the night. On a narrow ledge with no shelter, a single strong gust would have been enough to lose your balance on the steep, iced-over slope. By another version, it may have been simpler still. One person slipped on the icy ledge. Exactly what pushed the first of them, there is now no way to know. The precise picture of those final minutes can no longer be reconstructed. There was no one nearby who could tell what actually happened on that ledge between 11 in the morning and the silence that followed. The mountain left only the result. The group was found 700 meters below the place where they last made contact. Everything that lies between those 2 points will forever stay between them and the slope. Down below, by the tents of the high camp, one man remained the whole time, the one who had turned back on the night of the summit push. For several days, Valeri Shyamala stayed on the mountain before he could be brought down and evacuated. He is taken to a hospital in Kathmandu in satisfactory condition, with no threat to his life. He comes out of this story alive, and at the same time becomes the only one who can tell anything at all about how it began. Of the 6 people who set out for the summit, he alone remains. That makes him not just a survivor, but the chief witness to the tragedy. Journalists catch his every word, and Shamalo speaks calmly, like a man who understands all too well what he is talking about. He reminds them that he had warned his teammates in advance about the danger of the night departure. He explains, this summit can essentially be climbed only at night, and at night the mountain turns into a completely different place. Where by day it was quiet and clear, the wind suddenly rises and drives a blizzard, and that moment is almost impossible to predict. What saved him was not a premonition, but a sober assessment of his own condition. He felt himself failing, and he turned around, and that is what led him off the trail, along which the other 5 disappeared into the dark. He retreated not out of fear, but understanding the limit of his strength. On that night, that limit coincided with the line between life and death. For Shamalo, this is not his first encounter with death on a slope. Behind him lies a long career in which he has more than once parted ways with death by a single step. A high-altitude climber knows the simple arithmetic. Luck in the mountains is not endless, and one day it runs out. This time, it was precisely his refusal of the summit that left him alive. Finding the dead is only half the task. Bringing them down from 7,100 meters by ordinary means is impossible. At such altitudes, rescuers do not work with their hands. The thin air drains you within minutes, the steep slope gives no footing, and carrying a man down over the ice is a deadly task for the rescuers themselves. So the only path left is through the air. The evacuation is carried out by helicopter with a long line. This is a special and dangerous technique. A load is fixed to a cable beneath the aircraft, and the pilot flies so that the load on the long rope does not swing or snag on the terrain. At the very limit of the machine's altitude, right at the edge where the rotors have almost nothing to grip in the thin air, each such lift is a risk of its own. Step by step, the bodies are lowered down towards safer elevations. On the 16th of October, all 5 are brought to base camp. The operation succeeds. On this mountain that does not always happen. Many of those it has taken over the decades remained on the slopes forever. Reaching them is too dangerous, and the mountains are in no hurry to give back what is theirs. That makes this result all the more meaningful. Bringing all 5 down is an achievement of the expedition in its own right. Not a victory over the elements, but at least not a silent dot in an aerial photograph. Nepalese services and the Russian side work together, and behind the brief lines of the reports lies the labor of pilots and rescuers. The mountain that took 5 strong men this time at least gave them back, so that their loved ones could say goodbye in a human way. More than that could no longer be done. When 5 strong athletes die in a single expedition, the grief is no longer that of one family alone. The autumn of 2024 became one of the heaviest losses for Russian mountaineering in many years. An entire company of like-minded people was gone, led by a man who had devoted his life to mountain sport and headed the federation. In the climbing community, what happened is discussed for a long time. They argue about the price of the pure, oxygen-free style at altitudes above 8,000 meters, the very approach the team chose deliberately. This style is respected for its honesty, but it is exactly that style which leaves no room for error. Without oxygen, the body wears out faster, reactions slow, and on the narrow traverse below the summit, any hesitation can be the last. They argue about the route itself too. The long passage beneath the ridge is yet another reminder of why this peak holds its place among the deadliest of the 8,000ers, surpassed by only a few mountains on the planet. Standing apart in this story is Shamalo's decision to turn back. To an outsider, giving up the summit just a few hours from the goal might look like weakness. To those who understand the mountains, it is exactly the opposite. The ability to stop, to admit that your strength is not enough, and to turn around is valued here above any record. The story of 2024 adds 5 more names to the long list of those taken by the dazzling White Mountain. Alexander Dusheko, Oleg Kruglov, Vladimir Shistikov, Mikhail Nosenko, Dmitry Shpilevoy. Each of them walked a path in the mountains as long as a lifetime, and ended it on a single traverse below the summit. And the one man who came down carried with him forever the memory of that night when he said no to the mountain and stayed alive. In October of 1989, 2 Catalans are climbing the west face of Dhaulagiri, nearly 4,000 meters of sheer ice. At 7,500 meters, they're met by -40 and a winter that has come ahead of schedule. Their feet are turning white. There's no way out, and the two friends make an impossible choice. Each goes his own way. Jordi Canyamers will come down alive after 5 days of hallucinations. Francesc Dalmases will vanish forever, and his father will search for his son's body for 30 years. And one day he'll mistake a stranger on the ridge for him. What gave away the mistake, and why the mountain never gave up its own? That's what comes next. In the autumn of 1989, two friends decide to do what almost no one dares to attempt. Francesc Kiko Dalmases is around 31 years old. Jordi Canyamers is 25. They're tied together by a rope and by a shared way of seeing the mountains, a way that matters more to both of them than any summit. They call Dalmases a mountain poet. He goes to altitude the way other men write verse. He works as a patroller on the ski slopes, rescuing those who get into trouble in the snow. Behind him are 3 ascents of the north face of the Eiger, one of the most fearsome walls in the Alps, dreaded even by the strong, more than 26,000-meter peaks in the Peruvian Andes. In 1985, he climbed Saipal in the western Himalaya, far off the popular routes. Canyamers is younger, but experienced in his own right. A high-altitude guide and photographer, a close friend of Dalmases. In the mountains, where your partner holds your life on the end of a rope, that kind of friendship means more than any words. They climb the same way, Alpine style, traveling light. No long line of porters, no ropes fixed in advance, no chain of camps stretching up the slope, to come and to go as if they had never been there at all. The objective they choose suits their character, to repeat the Czech road of 1984 up the west face of Dhaulagiri. The wall rises through nearly 4,000 meters of unbroken vertical gain from base to summit, one of the largest continuous faces on the planet. The Czech lineup, it has still not been repeated by anyone decades later. The two Catalans want to be the first to climb it again, and to do it in the purest, most defenseless style that exists in the big mountains. They reach base camp beneath the wall back on the 27th of August. After that comes a long wait for weather and acclimatization beneath the sheer mass that fills half the sky. They set out onto the route itself only on the 3rd of October, when the autumn season is already rolling toward its close. Their tactics are harsh even by the standards of the big mountains. Capsule style means they have no rear guard. Every morning, they break down the camp, load the tent, the gas, the ropes, the food onto their backs, and carry it all up the wall themselves. There's nowhere to retreat to. Behind them is only bare ice. If something goes wrong, they'll have to descend the same way they came up, through the same wall, under their own power. There's a second kind of isolation too, one they don't suspect. The western side of Dhaulagiri is cut off from the rest of the mountain. From it, you can't see the classic northeast ridge, where other expeditions are working at the very same time. There's no radio contact between the sides. The two Catalans are locked onto their wall, as if in a sealed room without windows. And on that far side of the mountain, everything has already been decided. The teams on the ridge read the sky and understand the season is over. They pack up and go down, without waiting for things to get worse. These people see what Dalmases and Canyamers cannot, because that year, winter comes ahead of time, far ahead. It would later turn out to be one of the coldest winters in the Himalaya in a long while. The cold crashed down on the mountains when no one was yet expecting it. The two men on the west face climb upward, not knowing that the sky above them has already changed, and that the time they have left is running out faster than they can climb. On the night of the 8th into the 9th of October, they reach the ridge. The altitude is around 7,600 to 7,650 meters. Here, at the junction of the west face and the crest, they are overtaken by what could not have been foreseen from below. The mercury drops to about -40. At that altitude, it's not just a number, it's a temperature at which the air cuts the lungs, metal sticks to the skin, and the body begins to fail on its own, without any mistake. The cold seeps through the down jacket, through the sleeping bag, through any kind of protection, and there's nowhere to escape it. They pitch the tent right on the ice. The feet are the first to give out. The toes begin to turn white, a sure sign that blood is no longer reaching the extremities. Dalmases' injuries are still lighter. Canyamers' are worse. His fingers and toes are hit harder. Both understand what this means. Frostbite on an 8,000er does not heal and does not recede. It only grows with every hour spent at altitude. On the morning of the 9th of October, they try anyway to push for the summit. They take a step, then another, and they run into a wall that nothing can break through. For all their effort, they manage to advance only 80, maybe 100 meters, no more. The cold and the numbness in their legs force them to turn back to the tent. In that moment, it becomes clear. The old plan is dead. To reach the summit the way they had imagined and to descend calmly, that's no longer possible. The mountain is closing in on them from every side. The warmth is running out. The strength is running out. The time is running out. Now the question is no longer how to reach the summit, but how to stay alive at all when the usual way out is already gone. Each of them has his own path to life. The trouble is that those paths run in opposite directions. To descend back down the west face they came up in this state is impossible. It's too long and too technical for frozen feet. So they have to break through the mountain. Dalmases reasons. They should reach the summit and descend by the northeast ridge. That ridge is better known. Others climb it. There may be a prepared track and abandoned camps. Canyameres sees salvation differently. He wants to go straight down, by the north face, down a slope neither of them knows. Neither can convince the other. And so, they make a decision that people will pick apart for years afterward. Each will go his own way. The friends split between them the little they have. Canyameres takes the tent. With his feet, he needs the shelter more. Dalmases takes a light bivouac sack, a thin shell that barely holds in warmth. And so, they hand each other their last remaining chances, dividing them down the middle. This fork in the road will later be given a terrible name by those who tell their story: to die going up or to die going down. Not victory against defeat, but death against death. And each chooses the one that feels closer to him. On the 10th of October, Dalmases sets off toward the ridge. Canyameres manages to raise his camera and take a frame, the last photograph of his friend. In it, a figure slowly climbs upward through the snow, and then Dalmases' silhouette melts away on the slope, dissolving into the whiteness and the altitude. Canyameres watches him to the very last, not knowing that he's seeing his friend for the last time in his life. Alone on the north face, with frostbitten feet and the tent on his back, Canyameres begins a descent that will stretch out over 5 days. 5 days down a slope he has never seen and knows nothing about. The mountain meets him with everything at once. Underfoot, sometimes brittle crust that gives way without warning, sometimes bare ice mixed with rock, where he has to dig in with the front points of his crampons on numb feet. A thick fog settles over him, and visibility disappears. He moves almost blind, guessing his way. Between him and the lower slopes lie crevasses, any one of which could swallow a man without a trace. One night, a powder avalanche comes down on his tent. The mass of snow batters the thin walls, and he survives a blow that could have been the last. Exhaustion and altitude begin to play games with his mind. Hallucinations come, visions that blur reality. The frostbite grows worse and worse. His legs almost stop obeying him. And all this time, he has a single gas canister for the entire descent. On that canister depends water, and on water depends life. Without melted snow at that altitude, a man dehydrates within a few hours. Canyameres stretches the fuel as far as he can, rations every drop of gas, melts just enough snow to take a sip and not collapse. On the 5th day, he does come down, alive, worn out by the cold, on the edge of consciousness, but alive. A descent down an unknown wall with frostbitten feet and a single gas canister, the kind of thing from which men usually don't return. But from the other side of the ridge, no one comes. Dalmases doesn't appear, not at the bottom, not on any side of Dhaulagiri. 2 set out onto the wall. 1 came down. For most people, the story ended there. But back in Catalonia, there remained a man for whom it would not close for a very long time. This is Joan Dalmases, Kiko's father. His son didn't come back, and the father refuses to accept it as the end. He begins a search that will stretch across 3 decades. An entire life given to a single goal, to find his son's body somewhere out there, on the slopes of a mountain thousands of kilometers and weeks of travel from Catalonia. Joan has no helicopters, no money for large expeditions. All he has is letters and persistence. He gets in touch with everyone heading to Dhaulagiri. with climbers from different countries, with strangers who will one day find themselves high on that mountain. He asks them one thing: if you see a body, if you find anything at all, look closely. Is it my son? And one more request, one that reveals in him not only a grief-stricken father, but a man who understands who Kiko was. He begs them to look for his son's notebook, the journal in which the poet might have left his last lines, the last testimony of what happened to him up there. Joan believes that his son reached the summit. That belief sustains him through all the years. Not died for nothing, but reached it, climbed to where he wanted to go, and only then did the mountain take him. For the father, this matters so much that it becomes the foundation of his whole life. And on the northeast ridge of Dhaulagiri, there really is a body. Year after year, climbers heading to the summit by the standard route see it, the figure of a man on the snow. And rumors reach the father. Up there, high on the mountain, there's someone no one has brought down. In the spring of 2007, the father's hope flares up with new strength. Joan is convinced the figure that is spotted on the ridge year after year is his son. After 18 years of waiting, he finally sees his goal as close as it has ever been. Once again, he turns to the climbers of that season. Check the details, examine the body, help identify it. In April of that year, the experienced climber Iñaki Ochoa de Olza reaches the summit of Dhaulagiri. He examines the remains and comes to a conclusion that breaks the father's heart. It's not Kiko. The body most likely belongs to the German climber Albrecht Hamann. The proof turns out to be cruelly simple. Hamann died in the spring of 1995 on the descent near the very summit, and had lain on the ridge ever since, in plain sight of everyone who passed by. And it's the crampons that give him away. Ochoa de Olza notices that on the feet of the body are crampons of a model that didn't yet exist in 1989. Dalmases could not have had such gear. He disappeared 6 years before Hamann died. A small piece of iron crosses out what the father had believed for years. In that same season, the Italian climber Maria Rosa Morotti reports having seen 2 bodies near the summit, and one of them, perhaps, is Dalmases. But it's only a guess, confirmed by nothing. Dalmases is never identified. Joan Dalmases never closes the circle. He mistook a stranger for his son, was wrong, hoped again, and again found nothing. But to the end, he blames neither the mountain nor that choice on the saddle. He always defended the decision that his son and Canyamares made at -40. Each went his own way. One came back. The other was never found on Dhaulagiri. And 30 years on, the father's search breaks off in the same place where it began. Before her last expedition, she wrote just a few words, that she was looking forward to new heights. A few days later, on an icy slope of Dhaulagiri, at an altitude of around 6,680 meters, Russian champion Nadezhda Oleneva was walking ahead of her small team, without oxygen, without Sherpas, and, as it would turn out to be decisive, without an ice axe. And then she was simply gone from the slope. Her partners would find only a trekking pole and a long furrow in the snow, trailing down toward the blocks of ice. What drives one of the strongest female climbers in the country to walk across hard ice with nothing but poles? And why would the mountain never give her back? Nadezhda Oleneva was born in Perm, a city on the plains where not a single serious peak can be seen from any window. The nearest big mountains lie thousands of kilometers away. And in her childhood, there is not the slightest reason for her to one day become a high-altitude mountaineer. All her life, friends simply call her Nadia. That name will remain in dozens of interviews, posts, and obituaries. Short, homey. It hardly fits with the words master of sport and 8,000er. She comes to the mountains late, by mountaineering standards, in 2006, already an adult. Not as a child whose parents bring her to a club, but as a person who makes the choice herself. At first, it's just a few trips, to look, to try, to figure out whether it's for her. Many stop right there. They took a trip, brought back some photos, and returned to ordinary life. With Nadia, everything goes differently. Each trip pulls the next one along behind it. And what began as curiosity gradually turns into the work around which the rest of her life is built. This start almost from scratch is worth keeping in mind. Without it, you can't understand her story. No mountain childhood, no climbing family, no head start. Everything she will achieve will be earned through stubbornness and the kilometers of slopes covered as a grown woman. At the time of her death, her age is given differently. In some places 37, in others 38. The data don't agree. But everything else leaves no room for doubt. Over 17 years, she will become one of the prominent figures in Russian mountaineering. If you boil her sporting path down to a single number, the result is striking. More than 200 ascents in just under 2 decades. Each one is a separate trip, separate preparation, separate risk. 200 summits. That's not a list of victories on paper, but years spent on slopes in all kinds of weather, with a heavy pack in the cold, and at altitudes where the body works itself to exhaustion. Over these years, she earns the title of Master of Sport of Russia in mountaineering, a bar that few ever reach. She is brought onto the national team. This is no longer an amateur pursuit, but a professional level where Russia's strongest climbers compete. In 2017, she graduates from the Central School of Mountaineering Instructors, meaning she earns the right not just to go to the mountains, but to officially teach others to do so, to be responsible for other people's lives on the slope. Her specialty is the high-altitude technical class. Behind that dry term lies the hardest thing in this sport. Climbs up steep walls at great heights, where the technical difficulty of the route is compounded by thin air, cold, and fatigue. Here you can't just stubbornly push upward. You have to climb, belay, read the terrain, and all of that in a place where every movement costs twice as much. In 2022, she becomes champion of Russia in exactly this class. For a climber from Perm who started from nothing, this is the summit of her sporting career. Added to that are 4 more nominations for the Steel Angel Award, which honors the strongest female climbers in the country. Behind all these lines, it's easy to lose sight of a living person. Each of them was paid for with real days on the mountain, the cold, the heavy pack, the nights in a tent in the wind. There was also the Golden Ice Axe of Russia, the country's top mountaineering award, given for the strongest climbs of the year. Her name made the list of nominees for this prize twice. In this world, that reads unambiguously. A person had reached the level where routes are chosen not for their beautiful views, but for their reputation among professionals. But Nadezhda is not the kind of person who hoards achievements only for herself. Alongside her sporting career, she builds a second, no less important line of her life, that of a teacher. In 2017, she founds the Perm School of Mountaineering. Her native flatland city becomes a launch point from which people set off into the big mountains. A few years later, in 2021, she launches an all-Russian project called Mountain Guru, a school that teaches rock climbing, ice climbing, and high-altitude ascents. It's one thing to climb difficult walls yourself, and quite another to pass that skill on to dozens of people, many of whom would otherwise never have found themselves on a rope. For them, she becomes a mentor, the one who explains how to hold an ice axe, how to read a slope, how not to panic when there's nothing around but ice and emptiness. Her students will later remember not the titles, but exactly this, that she taught them to go to the mountains and to love them. Before her last expedition, she leaves a short note on social media, a few words about a new mountain ahead. At that moment, it's an ordinary remark from someone heading off on yet another expedition. No one reads anything alarming into it. For her, the mountain was never a game with death or a way to prove something to the world. It was her life's work, and it is in exactly this frame of mind that she sets off for Dhaulagiri, 8,167 meters, the 7th highest peak on the planet. That's what stands on the agenda for the autumn of 2023. Here, on this colossus, all the threads of her story come together. The route chosen is the classic one, along the northeast ridge, the very path most climbers take. Classic doesn't mean easy. It's a long, grueling ridge with avalanche-prone sections, where over the decades quite a few climbers have been lost. The style of the ascent is oxygen-free. This is the principal choice of strong, high-altitude athletes, to climb without oxygen bottles, without the help of Sherpas, relying only on their own bodies and their training. This style is valued above all in professional circles, but it also leaves no right to make a mistake. At altitude without oxygen, thoughts grow muddled, movements slow down, and fatigue builds up faster than a person can notice it. Nadia's team is small. 2 people are with her, Roman Abildaev and Radim Kashapov. a small self-contained group with no crowd of porters and guides, where everyone is responsible above all for themselves and has to make decisions on the slope alone. In this format, everything rests on the experience and caution of the participants. There's no one to catch someone who slips except the partner walking a few dozen meters away. The mountain itself lost its loud fame long ago, but being forgotten changes nothing about its character. It remains one of the most dangerous peaks for climbers, with abrupt weather, frequent avalanches, and steep ice slopes. A small team, an oxygen-free style, and a serious route. A combination that demands total focus. Nadia approaches it like familiar work. Ahead lies the push to Camp 2, an ordinary working day in the mountains. The 14th of October arrives. Early morning in the mountains is the coldest time of day, when the ice, after a night's freeze, becomes hard as stone. At this hour, the group begins its ascent, an ordinary acclimatization push, a crossing that an experienced team makes without much strain. Nadia goes first. She moves light, at her own pace, in a familiar and confident way. And here a detail appears that will later prove to be key. In her hands, she carries trekking poles. Not an ice axe, the mountaineer's main tool on ice, with which, in the event of a fall, you can dig into the slope and arrest the slide, but poles, light and convenient for walking yet useless on hard ice. On this stretch, she also walks without fixed rope protection, without an anchored rope to hold on to. In itself, this doesn't look reckless. Experienced climbers often cross seemingly simple sections light, saving their strength, especially when the slope looks gentle and familiar. The trouble is that a mountain slope is rarely uniform. This push is laid out across an ice slope. From above it looks even, but farther on, the terrain changes. About 200 meters up, the steepness increases and lower. Still, the slope breaks off into a field of seracs, huge blocks of ice, and turns into an icefall. The gentle beginning of the route leads to a place where a mistake is no longer forgiven. The morning is cold, the ice underfoot hard and slick. Nadia goes first, climbing upward at a steady pace. Behind her, a few dozen meters back, move Obildayev and Koshapov. So far, nothing foretells disaster. Altitude around 6,680 meters. What exactly triggers it? An awkward step, ice hidden beneath the snow, an instant loss of balance, can no longer be established. On a slope as hard as glass, 1 second is enough. With poles in your hands, you can't catch the ice. They slide off to the side, finding no purchase, and there's nothing to stop the slide once it begins. After that, the physics of the mountain takes over. Holding on to hard ice without an ice axe becomes impossible, and that very slope, gentle in appearance, becomes too steep to grip. By her partner's estimate, the fall carries her about 500 meters down, straight there, to the break in the slope and the seracs. No one sees the moment of the fall itself. Abildayev and Koshapov are walking behind, and the second when everything was decided lies outside their field of view. Most high-altitude tragedies have no witness, only an empty slope and guesswork. The picture has to be reconstructed after the fact. Climbing along their own path, the partners reach the spot where Nadia should be, and don't find her. Instead of a figure ahead, there's emptiness. In the mountains, that kind of silence reads instantly. If a person isn't where they just were and doesn't answer, it means the worst has happened. The two men stop and peer down, toward the place where the ice drops away to the break in the seracs. To understand what happened, they need to descend closer. What they find speaks for itself. On the slope lies her trekking pole. Nearby, a track in the snow, running downward, toward the break in the slope and the field of ice blocks. 2 signs, and both wordless. One explains why nothing stopped the fall, the other shows its direction, toward the most dangerous place on the route. Nadia herself is no longer on the slope. She has gone beyond the break, to a place you can't reach on foot. It's impossible to approach this zone over the ice, too steep and too dangerous. The team calls for a helicopter. On the morning of the 15th of October, the aircraft flies over the slope. From the air, the body can be made out, down there, among the blocks of ice. But that's where it ends. The helicopter can't land nearby or lift a load. The place is hemmed in by seracs and a web of crevasses, and the slopes themselves keep shedding avalanches. Any attempt to get close would mean a new deadly risk, this time for the rescuers. the search is called off. The mountain, the one almost forgotten today, does not give back the person who loved it. The Russian mountaineering community says goodbye to her as one of its strongest. A master of sport, a national champion, a mentor to dozens of students. Her friends from Perm speak briefly and heavily. The girl stayed in the mountains, and her last note, the line about looking forward to new heights, left without any hint of worry, now reads differently, like the unwitting farewell of a person for whom the mountains were not a risk, but a meaning. She was a doctor who understood altitude better than most, and the first woman to climb Kangchenjunga, the third highest peak on Earth. All her life, Ginette Harrison chose calculation over risk, and she valued the descent more than the summit. On the 24th of October, 1999, on the classic road up Dhaulagiri, high on the mountain, beside a Sherpa named Dawa, all of that stopped mattering in a single second. Her husband was on the very same mountain at that moment. And the next day, a man came to the foot of the peak whose fate would cross with her death in the most unexpected way. What can destroy a climber who has calculated everything? Ginette Harrison was born on the 28th of February 1958 in Britain, and from the very start, she walked two paths at once. She enrolled at the University of Bristol and trained to be a doctor, choosing a solid profession, one that demanded discipline, precise thinking, and the habit of being responsible for another person's life. Medicine became her craft, but it was not her only passion. Even in her student years, she was drawn to places where the air is thin and a mistake costs dearly. In time, she chose a rare specialty, high-altitude medicine. It was not chance, and it was not a fashionable gesture. Harrison wanted to understand what happens to the body at great heights, where there is half as much oxygen as at sea level, and where even a healthy body begins to fail. So, her two lives merged into one, a doctor who treats mountain sickness, and a climber who herself goes up to the very place where that sickness is born. At 25, she climbed Denali, the highest point in North America, a harsh and cold peak that tests newcomers for endurance. For many, it is a dream summit. For Harrison, it was only the beginning of the road. The mountains stopped being a hobby and became a second, parallel life that she led alongside her medical practice. A combination like that was unusual for those years. Most strong, high-altitude climbers live for the mountains entirely and cast everything else aside. Harrison would come back from expeditions to her patients, to the routine of medicine, and then go up again. She held both worlds at once. That was her whole character, the calm of a professional used to weighing risks, and the stubbornness of someone who returns again and again to the cold and the height. Calculation instead of recklessness, that principle would run through her entire career and make her one of the most prominent British female climbers of her generation. In the autumn of 1993, her path led her to the highest point on the planet. On the 7th of October, Harrison stood on the summit of Everest, becoming the second British woman to climb the highest mountain on Earth. Behind that achievement lay years of training, acclimatization, and a slow gain of altitude that she had planned with a doctor's precision. For her, Everest was not a wild dash, but the logical step of someone who had been going up for a long time. But that expedition changed more than her sporting record. On the slopes of Everest, she met an American, Gary Pfisterer. The mountains brought them together, a shared goal, a shared camp, a shared rhythm of climbing. What began as a partnership on an expedition grew into something far greater. Gary became her husband. From that point on, their life was two bonds at once. At home, they were husband and wife. On the mountain, they were a rope team, where one is responsible for the other with a rope and a decision. That is rare even among climbers, a husband and wife who share not only a household, but the most direct risk there can be. Each knew how the other moved, what the other trusted, where the other's limit lay. Almost all her major projects after 1993 were undertaken together with Gary. They planned expeditions as a single unit, discussing routes, timing, weather windows. It made their climbs more reliable. There was always someone beside her she could trust without reservation. But such closeness has another side, one that climbers try not to think about out loud. For now, though, only the climb lay ahead, and it would lead Harrison to her most celebrated results. By December of 1995, Harrison's record amounted to a rare achievement. She completed the 7 Summits program, the highest points of every continent. It is a marathon that stretches over years, different climate zones, different techniques, the ice domes of Antarctica, and the heat of the equator. On the 1st of December, she placed the final point and became the third woman in the world and the first British woman to complete that program. For most climbers, the 7 summits are the final goal of a career. For Harrison, it was only an intermediate milestone. She was drawn more and more toward the top tier of mountaineering, toward the 8,000ers, the 14 mountains above 8,000 meters, where the so-called death zone begins. There, the body stops recovering, and every hour spent up high works against a person. It was exactly this physiology that she, as a doctor, understood better than most. In 1997, she climbed Cho Oyu, one of the 8,000ers that often becomes a climber's first step into that class of heights. The ascent went cleanly, and it confirmed that Harrison was ready for the most serious mountains on the planet. And yet, she did not dissolve into the mountains entirely. Between expeditions, she returned to her medical practice, to ordinary life, to her patients. That rhythm, up and back, kept her in shape and stopped her from closing in on the summit race alone. Those who climbed with her noted the same thing. She rarely forced events, and she knew how to stop in time. By the end of the 90s, her name was already well known in the climbing community. She ranked among the strongest British high-altitude women, not because of loud declarations, but because of a measured progression from mountain to mountain. And her brightest result was still ahead, a mountain where women had died before her, and which not one of them had ever managed to climb and return from. That mountain was Kangchenjunga. On the 18th of May, 1998, Harrison climbed it by the north face and became the first woman on the summit of the third highest mountain on the planet. Kangchenjunga stands on the border of Nepal and India. Its name is translated as the 5 treasures of the Great Snows, and its reputation is grim. This mountain kills more often than it forgives. History made that success especially heavy in its price. Before Harrison, 4 women had died attempting to climb Kangchenjunga. The mountain seemed to refuse to let any of them off alive. Harrison knew this, and that is exactly why she valued not so much the summit itself as the safe return down. By her own words, the deaths of those who came before made her understand all the more keenly how fortunate she was to climb first among women and come down unharmed. In that single sentence lies her whole approach to the mountains. The doctor's knowledge worked at full strength. She understood how the body behaves on the edge, and she trusted that understanding more than thrill. That same year, 1998, she climbed the central summit of Shishapangma, another 8,000er on her list. The year turned out remarkably full and successful. After Kangchenjunga, people no longer wrote of Harrison merely as a strong British climber. They placed her among the best high-altitude women in the world. On the Great Mountains, every summit taken calls toward the next. Beyond Kangchenjunga rose a new goal, one that would cement her name, and at the same time become the last of her life. The spring of 1999 brought her another great mountain. On the 22nd of May, Harrison climbed Makalu, the 5th highest 8,000er, known for its steep slopes and capricious weather. She became the first British woman to reach that summit. The list of her great mountains kept growing, and every new ascent confirmed that she was at the peak of her form. By the autumn of that year, the choice fell on a new goal, Dhaulagiri, the 7th highest peak in the world. It is a mountain with a foul reputation, one of the most dangerous among the 8,000ers, known for sharp changes in weather and a high risk of avalanches. The ascent was planned by the classic route on the northeastern side, the most traveled line, but far from a harmless one. This time, Gary Pfisterer was beside her once more. He was not just a participant, he led the expedition, which had 11 people. It was their familiar arrangement, the husband leading the team, the wife climbing within it, both on the same mountain. Behind them lay years of climbing together, and for Harrison, Dhaulagiri was one more carefully weighed step, not a desperate gamble. The team organized its work along a scheme honed on the Great Mountains: intermediate camps, fixing ropes, gradual acclimatization with ascents and descents. Everything went according to the plan of experienced people who know the price of haste on an 8,000er. Harrison, as before, did not rush events and kept her usual deliberate pace. But Dhaulagiri differs from most mountains in one respect. Here disaster often comes not from exhaustion and not from a climber's mistake, but from above. A slope that dozens of climbers pass without incident can, in a single moment, come into motion. And then it is not skill that decides, but chance and the place where a person happens to be in that second. The 24th of October, 1999, arrived. Harrison was working on the classic route, high on the mountain, where the slope grows steeper and snowfields hang over the climbers' heads. Beside her went a Sherpa named Dawa, her partner on this stretch. Two experienced people doing familiar work at great altitude, where every movement is measured and considered. And then the mountain showed its character. High above them, an avalanche broke loose. Such a force gives no warning and has no chosen target. It does not pick who is stronger or who is more careful. The mass of snow came into motion and swept over both climbers at once. At such heights and with such force in the release, a person has almost no chance to do anything. It is all decided faster than the awareness of what is happening can arrive. Ginette Harrison and the Sherpa Dawa died. She was 41 years old. At the peak of her career, a few months after the first British ascent of Makalu and a year and a half after the historic Kangchenjunga, her path was cut short on a route she would have passed in many other cases, without a single incident. The hardest part of this story is that her husband was on the same mountain at that time. Gary Pfisterer was leading the expedition. He was nearby, within the team. The thing that those who climb in pairs try not to say out loud happened for real. The disaster struck two people at once, the one caught in the avalanche, and the one who remained below and could change nothing. The man with whom she had shared a home, a rope, and almost all the great summits lost her at a distance that could not be reached. Word of her death spread quickly. Through the camps on different sides of the mountain, the news passed, and the familiar hum of expedition life gave way to silence. On the other side of the mountain, in those same days, an entirely different man was preparing to set out. The Slovenian Tomaž Humar stood at the foot of the south face of Dhaulagiri, one of the greatest and most dangerous walls in the world, a giant precipice that had remained unconquered for years. He planned to climb it alone, in pure alpine style, without partners and without a supply of oxygen. It was a plan at the edge of the possible. On the 25th of October, the day after Harrison's death, Humar set out onto the wall with a supply of gear and food for 10 days. But before the start, he found the entire base community of the mountain in mourning. People who had only just been preparing to storm the summit walked about subdued. The talk was all about one thing. The death of the first woman to climb Kangchenjunga fell over base camp as suddenly as the avalanche had fallen over the slope. So, on a single mountain, two fates crossed that might never have met. One was cut short, the other was only beginning. Humar's solo up the south face would stretch across 10 days, and later it would be called one of the greatest ascents of the decade. Ginette Harrison is remembered above all as the first woman on Kangchenjunga and as a doctor who understood altitude from within. Her whole career rested on a rare balance between passion and calculation. Again and again she chose the return. She valued the descent above the summit, and she did not confuse stubbornness with courage. But on a mountain where avalanches fall, there is a threat against which any calculation is powerless. A careful person who had calculated everything happened to be in the wrong place in that one single second when the snow gave way. And her story is not a tale of a mistake. It is rather a reminder. In the great mountains, the last word always belongs to the mountain itself. He climbed 8,000-meter peaks in brutal cold, in places where almost everyone else turned back. On the 14th of January, 2005, he became the first person in history to summit Shishapangma in winter. So, how did it happen that this man died not on a summit push, not in a hurricane, and not on a sheer wall? On the 8th of April, 2009, at an altitude of just 5,500 meters, during a routine acclimatization on Dhaulagiri, the snow gave way beneath Piotr Morawski's feet. 25 meters straight down, into an icy crevasse. His teammates were right there, but they could not reach him in time to save his life. This is the story of why a mountain kills not only on the summit. There are climbers who chase easy peaks and good weather. Piotr Morawski was not one of them. A Pole, born in 1976, he chose from the very beginning the harshest and most merciless side of the great mountains, altitude and cold. An engineer and physicist by training, a man with a precise analytical mind, he came to the mountains not for the adrenaline. He was led there by university mountaineering clubs, where climbing was understood as a craft in which the head mattered no less than the legs. The Polish school of high-altitude climbing was already a legend by then. It was the Poles in the 70s and 80s who turned winter ascents of the 8,000ers into a separate, almost impossible discipline. Where most expeditions packed up with the arrival of the autumn cold, the Poles were only just getting started. Frost below, -40, hurricane winds, nights at the very edge of human endurance. All of this they called their season. Morawski grew up inside this tradition. He was not a loud hero. Those who climbed rope to him describe a calm, methodical, level-headed man who rarely raised his voice and almost never panicked. At high altitude, where many people's nerves give out, his composure worked for the whole team. He knew how to wait, he knew how to turn back, and he weighed risk the way you solve an equation. By the age of 30, Morawski had a name in world Himalayan climbing, something hundreds of strong climbers never achieve. People knew him not from loud interviews, but from summits reached in places where others would not even step out of the tent. And the most important thing was still ahead of him. On a frosty January night, on the slope of a mountain that only a handful had ever reached. To understand how rare what he did really was, you have to picture a winter 8,000er from the inside. It is not just a cold mountain. It is a place where the atmosphere itself becomes an enemy. The pressure drops. There is half as much oxygen as at sea level, and the wind carries not snow, but hard, grinding ice. In summer, hundreds come here. In winter, almost no one. On the 14th of January, 2005, he did the thing that he had, in essence, gone to the mountains for. The first winter ascent in history of Shishapangma, an 8,000er standing 8,027 meters tall, the last of the planet's 14 giants that no one had yet claimed in the cold season. Beside him was the Italian Simone Moro. Their partnership was no accident. Two men of similar temperament, both stubborn, both willing to endure to the very limit. On the summit push, any mistake would have meant the end, and turning back at the last moment was something they would not allow themselves. When they reached the top, it was reported all over the world. Morawski's name, until then known mostly to specialists, became known far beyond Poland. Across all of history, only a handful had ever pulled this off. It is not a line on a list of achievements, but a league of its own, one that even very strong climbers never enter. After that January night, Morawski's name was spoken among those for whom the unthinkable becomes possible. He was only 28, and ahead of him, it seemed, lay years and years of great mountains. A successful ascent often drives partners apart. With Simone Moro, the opposite happened. After the triumph on the slopes in Tibet, the Italian and the Pole kept climbing together, and their alliance became one of the standout partnerships of the decade in Himalayan climbing. They trusted each other the way you only trust people with whom you have shared a tent on the edge of survival. In these years, his tally of 8,000ers grows. Peaks of the Gasherbrum Massif and other giants appear on the list, and he takes them all in that same recognizable style. Technical, without bravado, with cold calculation. He was not the kind to throw himself at a wall for a record at any cost. He counted the weather, counted his strength, and always kept the way back in mind, because he knew the descent kills more often than the climb. In the summer of 2008, he comes to Dhaulagiri for the first time, the 7th highest mountain in the world. Together with Moro, he reaches the summit. That time the mountain let them both go, alive and unharmed. Another success, another line in the biography. No one could have known that in less than a year this same mountain would take him, and in a place where no one expects death at all. Behind all these ascents stood more than just an athlete. At home in Poland, a family was waiting for Morawski, a wife and 2 small children. Every expedition was, for them, a temporary separation, a departure for several months to places from which you cannot call home every evening. He would leave, do his work, and come back. It happened again and again, until one day the familiar cycle was cut short at what seemed the safest stage of all. In the spring of 2009, the Polish team stands once more at the foot of the familiar slope. But repeating something already done held no interest for Morawski. The goal was more ambitious, a new route. For a man of his level, the ordinary classic line was no longer a challenge. He needed a line no one had ever climbed before. The start of the expedition was the usual, almost everyday work. Setting up camps, ferrying loads upward, fixing ropes, slowly gaining altitude and coming back down. This routine repeats on every great mountain. And to an experienced climber, it is familiar to the point of automatic. The most important, and at the same time, the least noticeable part of this routine is acclimatization. Without it, there is nothing to do on an 8,000er. The body has to get used to the thin air gradually. You climb and descend, you sleep higher and higher, you give the blood time to build its defense against altitude. It is a mandatory stage, and at the same time, it is considered one of the safest. You are not storming a summit here, not hanging on a sheer wall, not crossing avalanche gullies under falling rock. Here you simply walk up and down a familiar, relatively gentle stretch. The 8th of April, 2009, turns out to be exactly that kind of working day. Nothing out of the ordinary, the team moves between camps, gaining and losing altitude on schedule. Morawski is descending from the second camp. The altitude is around 5,500 meters. For a man who had slept beneath the clouds at 8,000 meters in the depths of winter, this is almost a stroll, the ground floor of the mountain. No difficult technical section, no deadly ridge, no hurricane wind. Just a glacier, just a descent. One of thousands of identical steps in his life in the mountains. A glacier holds a secret that every climber knows, and that, all the same, is easy to forget in the routine of an ordinary day. The ice beneath your feet is moving. It cracks. It splits into deep fractures, and the snow above seals these fractures with thin bridges that look like an ordinary even surface. Beneath the white blanket there can be a void of tens of meters. There is no way to guess it. The snow holds, and then it stops. It was exactly such a section that Morawski was crossing. The snow bridge beneath him did not hold. The support vanished in an instant, without a single second to react, and the man who had survived winter 8,000ers went down, into a glacial crevasse about 25 meters deep. There was nothing left to grab onto, nothing to stop him. His teammates from the Polish squad were nearby. They did not lose their heads and went to work at once, the way professionals work, for whom saving a partner is not even a question. But the crevasse turned out to be a trap, not only for the man who had fallen. Descending into a narrow ice fracture to such a depth is extremely difficult. The space is tight, the ropes tangle in the bends, and at any moment, snow can come down from above. And time was working against everyone. They did everything that was humanly possible at that altitude and in those conditions. And still, they could not bring him out alive. The mountain would not wait. The man who had survived the cruelest slopes on the planet remained in an ice crevasse, right beside his teammates. The news spread instantly. The death of Piotr Morawski shook Poland, where high-altitude climbing had long become part of the national pride, and it echoed painfully across the entire community of climbers. This death seemed far too unjust for a man of his caliber. And it is in this very contradiction that the thing which still will not let go lies. A climber who had slept at 8,000 meters in the harshest season. A man who walked where almost everyone else turned back, died on a routine acclimatization, at an altitude half that of his summits, on a stretch the team considered little more than a rest between the real work. The mountain kills not only on the summit, it kills in the familiar, in the things you stop being afraid of. A snow bridge on a glacier does not distinguish who is standing before it, a beginner or one of the best high-altitude climbers on the planet. For everyone who travels across glaciers, this case became a hard lesson. Where the ice moves and cracks, calculation and experience do not always protect you. Sometimes everything comes down to whether the snow under your foot will hold the next step. Roping up and belaying on hidden glaciers after stories like this is talked about with particular severity, but behind the statistics and the conclusions remained a simple human loss. From that expedition, a father never returned to the family waiting for him in Poland, and Simone Moro lost not just a partner, but a man with whom he had shared the most important climbs of his life. In the history of mountaineering, Piotr Morawski will forever remain the first to climb Shishapangma in winter, and also the man whose death showed that in the great mountains there are no small things and no guarantees, even on the simplest of slopes. A wealthy client pays tens of thousands of dollars to climb an 8,000er, and someone else goes up that very same mountain first, without any fixed ropes across unstable snow, just to set those ropes for him. On the 19th of September, 2018, on Dhaulagiri, the 7th highest peak in the world, An avalanche swept over 7 such men between Camp 2 and Camp 3. 6 of them made it out. 24-year-old Dawa Gyalje Sherpa stayed behind, buried under the snow. That same season, a famous veteran walked off that mountain alive. This is the story of the invisible price paid by those who make a mountain safe for others, and pay for it with their lives, while their names go unremembered. This man had a real particular fate, even though in the season's reports it would dissolve almost without a trace. His name is Dawa Gyalje Sherpa. He is a citizen of Nepal, and he is only 24 years old. He is not climbing toward the summit for glory, for a record, or for a line in some sporting chronicle. He does not dream of planting a flag at the highest point, and he is not chasing the attention of cameras. His task is far more mundane and far more dangerous. He fixes the ropes and lines that paying clients will later use to climb. There are people who buy an ascent of an 8,000er, and there are those who go up the mountain in advance and make it passable for those people. Dawa belongs to the second kind. His job is to go first where others will later move along ready-made fixed lines, to take part of the deadly risk off the shoulders of those who paid and carry it himself. When the season ends, the world's publications write about famous veterans, about the stars of high-altitude mountaineering, about those chasing a collection of the 14 highest mountains on the planet. Their faces adorn the covers, their interviews spread across websites and magazines. And the name of a 24-year-old Sherpa gets lost somewhere in the season summary, in an impersonal line, like, one of the local guides was killed. No photograph, no life story, no question of who he was and what he left behind. This story is about precisely him and about others like him, about those who remain nameless even when they give the most precious thing they have. Dhaulagiri, the 7th highest peak in the world, has long killed quietly, making no distinction over who stands before it, a celebrity or a worker. In September of 2018, it took a worker. And why his death slipped so easily past the headlines becomes clear once you understand who actually builds the road to these summits. Long before the first client sets foot on the slope, a special group of people goes up the mountain. They are called the fixing team. These are Sherpa guides whose job is to hang hundreds of meters of fixed rope across the most difficult and dangerous sections of the route. They go first, across untouched snow, across bare ice, without a single ready-made anchor above their heads. Every step they take on such a slope is a step into the unknown, because the only way to test how solid the path is with your own body weight. On Everest, this profession even has a name of its own, the icefall doctors. That is what they call the ones who, year after year, lay the trail through the Khumbu icefall, set ladders over the crevasses, and fix ropes where the ice can collapse at any second. The clients arrive much later, when everything is already done. The ropes are anchored, the dangerous gaps are bridged, the route is marked. A wealthy climber sees a well-prepared road. He barely stops to think about who built it and at what cost. And the cost is high. Sherpas cross the deadly sections many times more often than any foreigner, every season, back and forth, loaded down with gear. A foreigner crosses the icefall a handful of times during an expedition. A Sherpa crosses it dozens of times, and the statistics confirm it. Of all the people who have died on Everest over the decades, more than a third are working local guides. Not clients, not stars, but the ones who carried the loads and hung the ropes. They are paid for this work. Fixing the lines to the summit can bring in several $1,000s for a season, serious money in the mountain regions of Nepal. But that sum does not buy safety. It buys a willingness to take the risk instead of someone else. The Sherpa makes the mountain passable for everyone, except for himself. And it is exactly this kind of man who steps onto the slopes of Dhaulagiri in the autumn of 2018, not yet knowing that not the whole team will come back. Autumn of 2018. Dhaulagiri is once again preparing to receive climbers. The 7th highest peak in the world rarely forgives haste or an underestimated slope. It is one of those mountains that punish overconfidence quietly and immediately. For the commercial expeditions to be able to climb, someone has to go up the route earlier and prepare it. That work is taken on by a fixing team of 7 Sherpas. Among them is Dawa Gyalje. Their task is specific and clear, to connect 2 high camps with rope, Camp 2 and Camp 3. This is one of the key sections of the classic route, and without reliable fixed lines, clients have no business there. When the paying expedition members arrive later, they will move through here along ropes already hung, clipping a carabiner onto someone else's work. But for now, there are no fixed lines. There is only the slope, the snow, and 7 men who have to secure all of it with their own hands. And the snow on that slope is treacherous. After bad weather, it has settled in unstable layers. The upper layer rests weakly on the lower one, and it takes very little to set the whole mass in motion. To an experienced eye, this is an alarming sign. But work is work, and expedition schedules don't wait for good weather. The 7 move up the slope, weighed down by heavy coils of rope, ice gear, anchors. Each carries on his back not only the load, but also the responsibility of making sure the future route turns out to be safe. One detail that's easy to forget: not one of these 7 men is paying to climb. On the contrary, they are being paid to go up the mountain first and take on its greatest danger. These are not tourists or athletes chasing a personal achievement. They are workers of the heights, for whom the wall is a place of earning a living, and the risk is part of the job. And on what was, for them, an ordinary working day, on a familiar section, the line between labor and death turned out to be thinner than anyone expected. Everything happens fast. The slope between the 2 camps comes alive in an instant. The snow slab, that very same unstable upper layer, breaks loose and crashes down onto the working group. One moment, 7 men were fixing ropes, advancing step by step, and the next, all 7 are caught in a torrent of snow and ice that drags them down the slope. The avalanche does not choose. It makes no distinction between an experienced guide and a newcomer, between the one who went first and the one who brought up the rear of the rope team. 6 of the Sherpas somehow manage to fight their way out of the snow mass. Battered, shaken, they find the strength to descend to base camp and raise the alarm. But Dawa Gyalje. Sherpa does not come out of the torrent. The 24-year-old guide is buried and swept down beneath the mass of snow, where finding a person is all but impossible. The response comes at once. The operator agency that organized the work quickly gets a helicopter into the air. The pilot passes again and again over the area where the avalanche came down, scanning the slope from above. The rescuers stare into the churned-up snow, hoping to catch sight of anything at all. A piece of gear, a patch of color, any trace. But the mountain stays silent. From the air, not the slightest sign of the missing man can be found. The snow has reliably covered what it took. So ends the working day of Dawa Gyalje. Not on the summit, not in a moment of personal triumph, but on a nameless stretch of slope that he was preparing for people who were complete strangers to him. He stays on the mountain he was making safe for others, having never been granted that safety himself. And while his 6 companions are recovering down below, on that same mountain in those very days, there is a man from an entirely different world. A famous veteran whose name is precisely the one that will make it into every report. In those same days, in the base camp of Dhaulagiri, there is a Spaniard, Carlos Soria, a figure known to the entire mountaineering world. He is nearly 80, and this is already his 9th attempt to climb this mountain. Dhaulagiri remains one of the few peaks missing from his collection of the 14 highest 8,000ers on the planet. For a man of that age, the attempt itself is already a feat that people write about with admiration. But after the Sherpa's death, Soria makes a decision that speaks to his character. He calls off the expedition. He gives up the summit he had pursued for so long and so stubbornly. He states the reason plainly: dangerous conditions on the mountain and respect for his own team. The mountain is impassable, he says, and he adds separately that it is not about his bad knee, which people had also talked about. He is leaving because of the state of the slope and out of respect for the people who take risks beside him. In this decision lies a bitter truth about how high-altitude mountaineering really works. Soria is a star, a veteran, a man whose attempts the world's publications cover, and he walks off the mountain alive, while a 24-year-old worker, who is preparing a safe path for people like Soria, stays beneath the avalanche forever. One gives up his dream and goes home. The other does not come back at all. Soria himself would later say that he hopes to return the following spring and, one day, finally climb this summit. For him, Dhaulagiri is an unfinished chapter, one he can come back to again. For the family of Dawa Gyalje, there will be no again. And behind that contrast stands the entire economics of the industry, where a guide's labor is valued incomparably lower than the risk he takes on. The whole of commercial mountaineering rests on the labor of local guides. Without them, the ascents of wealthy foreigners onto the 8,000ers would simply be impossible. The tens of thousands of dollars a client pays go toward the organization, the permits, the gear, the support. In a word, toward that cleared path along which all he has to do is climb. And what does the Sherpa get? For that same season, many times less. And yet he carries the main risk. He hauls loads across dangerous sections, sets up and equips the high camps, hangs the ropes at the start of the season, and takes them down at the end. He does everything without which the mountain would remain impassable for the paying participants. His hands and his back are the foundation on which this whole industry stands. But in the expedition's financial scheme, he is worth incomparably less than the people he serves. What also matters is where these men come from. Many Sherpas come from the mountain districts of Nepal, where the choice of work is extremely limited and the earnings are small. High-altitude labor on the 8,000ers is one of the few ways to feed a family. So, behind every guide stands a family that depends on his seasonal income. And when such a man dies, for the industry it is a line in a season's report, while for the family it is the loss of a breadwinner, hence the asymmetry. The names of the clients end up in books, documentaries, and interviews. People tell their stories, dissect their achievements, keep their photographs. But the death of the one who made that ascent possible turns into an impersonal statistic of the season. Dawa Gyalje is one of those names that's easy to overlook, and yet behind it stands a real life, cut short far too soon. 24 years, that was the whole of the life granted to Dawa Gyalje. He died at work, making someone else's dream attainable. Some of those who would later climb on his ropes would come home heroes, with photographs against the backdrop of the summit, while the man who laid out the path for them stayed lying beneath the snow of the 7th highest mountain in the world. Dhaulagiri never gave back his body. His 6 companions from the fixing team came back alive that day, but their return did not mean the end of this profession. They went on doing the very same thing, carrying loads, hanging ropes on the dangerous sections. And every new season, new teams again go first, taking on the risk that will later be lifted from someone else's shoulders. This, then, is the invisible price of the great mountains. The labor of the guide stays unnoticed right up until the day something goes wrong. As long as all is well, hardly anyone speaks of them. Their work remains an invisible backdrop behind other people's ascents, and only tragedy, for a single moment, pulls a particular name and a particular fate out of the shadows, only to release them straight back into obscurity. The story of Dawa Gyalje is a reminder of who really pays for the safety of a summit. It is paid for by young workers of the heights, who are rarely called by name, and not by the stars on the covers, nor by the veterans whose attempts get analyzed in magazines. Behind every successful ascent, behind every happy photograph against the sky, stand people like him. And it is worth remembering, at least once in a while, at what cost someone else's dream is handed to them. Iris, I'm at the summit. 3 words with 3 exclamation marks, sent from a height of 8,167 meters by a happy grandfather to his little granddaughter. This is Antonio Sykaris, the first Greek to climb 5 of the greatest mountains on the planet. On the 11th of April, 2022, he stands on the very top of Dhaulagiri, and less than a day later, he is gone. What turned a moment of absolute triumph into tragedy in just 15 hours? Why did an experienced high-altitude climber reach his goal, yet fail to make it back down? This is a story about how close victory and reckoning truly stand. In a country where the mountains are low, and where mountaineering was never a mass sport, a man appears who, year after year, climbs to places no one from his homeland had ever reached. Antonio Sykaris is known throughout the entire Greek mountaineering world. He's around 60, and behind him already lie 5 8,000ers, giants more than 8 kilometers tall, of which there are only 14 on the entire planet. No Greek before him had ever climbed to such heights. The list of his summits reads like a roll call of the most fearsome names in the Himalayas. Everest, the highest point on Earth. Lhotse, the 4th peak in the world, Everest's neighbor on the same massif. Kangchenjunga, the 3rd, and one of the most dangerous, Manaslu. Annapurna, with the reputation of a killer. Each of these summits on its own is an achievement people give years of their lives for. Sykaris collected them one after another. For Greece, small by mountaineering standards, he becomes a figure of national scale. The newspapers write about him. People recognize him on the street. The country takes pride in him. He himself is moving toward a personal goal, to collect as many of the planet's highest peaks as he can, to work his way through the list of 14 8,000ers as far as his strength and luck will carry him. Step by step, without rushing. Dhaulagiri was meant to be just another rung in this lifelong climb. The seventh peak in the world, the very one that for decades had claimed climbers of every kind of fate. For Sykaris, simply another goal, another height to add to the collection he was building up, mountain by mountain. Later, even the head of the Greek government, Prime Minister Mitsotakis, would speak of him. He would admit that he knew Sykaris personally, that they had talked about what drives a person to push beyond the limits of his own abilities. But that would come later. For now, before us is simply a stubborn Greek, in love with the heights, who was planning to add one more snow-white giant to his list. The big mountains are rarely the calling of a mature man. Usually people reach 8,000 meters when they're young, when the body forgives mistakes and the lungs cope easily with thin air. Sykaris goes against that rule. For him, altitude isn't a burst of youth, but a passion that flared up in his mature years and never faded until the very end. He doesn't take summits by storm. He closes them out methodically, like a man used to seeing things through to the finish. One season, one mountain, sometimes a retreat and a return, then another attempt. Everest, Lhotse, Kangchenjunga, Manaslu, each peak on his list was paid for with months of preparation, long marches, nights intense in a biting wind. This is the path not of a sprinter, but of a marathon runner. In the winter of 2021, he takes on one of the most brutal challenges that exists in all of mountaineering, a winter ascent of K2, the second peak in the world. Winter K2 breaks even the strongest professionals, frosts beyond -40, hurricane winds, a darkness in which simply surviving is already a feat. Sykaris went there as a man who was no longer young. That alone tells you what kind of steel his character was made of. Those who knew him described the Greek the same way. Stubborn, enduring, emotional in that southern way, truly in love with the mountains. He could rejoice over a summit openly, like a child, and he grieved just as openly. And back home, in Greece, someone was always waiting for him. Between expeditions there was ordinary life, family, loved ones for whose sake he returned from the heights every single time. Among them, a little granddaughter named Iris, a name he would carry with him all the way to the very top of Dhaulagiri, and right into one short phrase that became a part of this story. April 2022. At the foot of the seventh peak in the world, a base camp is unfolding, and among the few who came to the mountain at the very start of the season is Antonios Sykaris. The season is only just spinning up. The slopes are nearly empty. The crowds of commercial expeditions haven't arrived yet. The mountain stands white and quiet, deceptively calm. Beside the Greek is his constant companion, a Sherpa named Dawa, not some hired porter for a single push, but a longtime friend and rope partner, a man with whom Sykaris had already climbed more than one height. They worked as a pair and trusted each other the way only those who have shared cold and danger together can. A team of two is light and fast, but vulnerable. If something goes wrong, there's almost no help nearby. For the route they chose the classic line, the northeast ridge, the very line by which most people climb this peak. A known road, but no less treacherous for it. Avalanche-prone slopes, long marches, weather that can turn over in an hour. The plan is simple and clear to any high-altitude climber. Climb gradually, setting camps higher and higher. Let the body grow used to the lack of oxygen. Wait for a weather window, a short stretch of calm between storms. And in that window, make the dash to the summit and come back down. There is only one backdrop that no plan and no experience can push aside. Sykaris is around 60. Behind him lie dozens of expeditions, years at altitude, and accumulated exhaustion that no rest can wash away. A young body forgives forced marches to 8,000 meters. The body of a mature man remembers every single one of them. And on Dhaulagiri, this arithmetic of years and strength would, for the first time, work against him. But he would realize it far too late. Monday, the 11th of April. The time is nearing 20 minutes past noon. At a height of 8,167 meters, on the very crown of Dhaulagiri, stands a man who had been walking toward this place his entire adult life. Antonio Sykaris has reached the summit. Beside him is Dawa, the Sherpa who walked the whole way with the Greek, from the first camp to this dazzling point. Beneath his feet, clouds and the ridges of the Himalayas stretching off toward the horizon in every direction. Above his head, only sky. In moments like these, the exhaustion retreats, and one pure feeling remains. You did it. Sykaris takes out his phone and sends messages down to his loved ones. He dedicates his achievement broadly and generously to all Greeks and all mountaineers. Those words are the whole of him, a man who carried up to the heights not only his own ambition, but pride in his small mountain country. And then he writes one more line, the shortest and the most human of them all. To his little granddaughter, left behind at home, thousands of kilometers away from here, he sends 3 words with 3 exclamation marks. Iris, I'm at the summit. There's no bravado in those words. It's the delight of a grandfather who wants someone he loves to share his brightest moment with him. Sykaris at the peak of his triumph, the goal reached, another 8,000 are taken, his list of summits one great mountain longer. But this triumph has a cruel flip side, one that every high-altitude climber knows, and that, in a happy moment, no one wants to think about. The summit of an 8,000er is only half the path. The hardest half is still ahead, and it begins right now. The minutes of joy end quickly. The two of them turn and, step by step, leave the crown of the mountain along the ridge that brought them here. Up here, above 8,000 meters, the human body slowly fades. There's too little air to recover, and every extra hour at such a height drains strength that can never be regained. Sykaris's body is worn to the limit. The climb took everything, the immense physical strain, the nervous exhaustion of many hours of work on the edge. According to the team's official statement, he was moving without enough supplemental oxygen, the very thing that helps the brain and muscles hold on where the air is half as thick as down on the plains. Every meter of descent comes harder. The steps grow shorter and slower, the pauses between them longer. And this is where it becomes clear why the word rope partner exists in the mountains at all. Dawa does not abandon his friend. He doesn't go down alone, even though he himself is collapsing after the climb. Hour after hour he guides the Greek, supports him, drags him, won't let him fall asleep in the cold, because sleep at such a height means the end. In the darkness, in the cold, on a narrow ridge, one man fights for the life of another with the last of his strength. The goal is close and at the same time agonizingly far, Camp 3, just a little lower down the slope. There they can shelter from the wind, warm up, catch their breath, wait for help. Only a few hundred meters of descent separate them from relative safety. But on an 8,000er, that's no stroll. It's hours of moving over difficult terrain in oxygen starvation. And between the sun-drenched crown and the life-saving tent below, there turn out to be too many meters and too little strength. The night passes its midpoint. Around 4 in the morning, on Tuesday the 12th of April, at a height of roughly 7,400 meters, Sykaris's body gives out for good. He loses his strength right where so little remained to the life-saving camp just above Camp 3, almost at the very goal of this endless night. The numbers of this drama speak for themselves. From the summit, where a day earlier he had sent his happy messages, the Greek is separated by about 760 meters of descent, and by almost 15 hours of unbroken struggle, 15 hours in which he walked, held on, clung to life, while Dawa let him down. 15 hours on the edge, in oxygen starvation, in the cold, far too long even for a very strong man. Dawa does everything within human power, but against altitude, cold, and total exhaustion, even the most loyal friend is powerless. Saving the Greek is no longer possible. Help can't reach them in time, and time at such a height doesn't wait. And here is what makes this story so piercing. Between the joyful message from the summit and his death on the descent, less than a day passed. Just moments before it was, Iris, I'm at the summit, 3 words full of happiness, and now he is gone. Triumph and tragedy were divided not by years and not by months, but by a few hours of a single night. Antonio Sykaris becomes the first casualty of the spring Himalayan season of 2022, the first name on the mournful list of that spring. A man who raised the Greek flag on 5 of the greatest peaks on Earth remains on the slope of the 6th, the one that let him reach the summit, but would not let him come down. The news from Dhaulagiri reaches the Mediterranean country almost instantly. There, where high-altitude mountaineering was always a rarity, where there are no 8,000ers of their own, and almost no tradition of great Himalayan expeditions, they lose the one hero of such stature. Greece learns that its most famous conqueror of summits will not return. The Prime Minister speaks publicly, the very acquaintance mentioned earlier now sounding across the whole country like a farewell. Those words are an acknowledgement of what the Greek was for his homeland, not just an athlete, but a man through whom an entire people touched the highest points on the planet. He blazed a trail that almost no one walked after him. His story closes a long line of names that this mountain has taken over the decades. The 7th peak in the world does not choose by merit. It took the very young and the seasoned masters with dozens of ascents behind them. It carried off those who went light, without oxygen, and those who were led by experienced Sherpas. Before that white slope, all are equal. And in each of these fates, one bitter truth repeats itself, one that Sykaris' final journey showed with particular clarity. The joy of the summit is always paid for with the danger of the descent. The mountain gives away its beauty generously, but sets the price itself and collects it without warning. Antonio's Sykaris managed to shout out over the airwaves his happy, "I'm at the summit," but the road back, the heights kept for themselves.